Hospital Porters, Pride and Dignity, Stop the New World Order, welcome to Panwo TV. That's right, I'm back and I'm here for another reply video to Steve Mumbling. Right now, Steve Mumbling actually did a... has done a video, which I want to reply to, obviously. But this is like a second reply on the same subject, because Steve actually did a video a few months ago about the moon landings. And I made a video called The Moon Landings, a reply to Steve Mumbling. I can't resist replying to Steve Mumbling these days, because he just... we disagree on so much, but we are willing to stick to be on a logical level, and, you know, unlike so many other skeptics where you disagree and then you end up fighting and hurling personal abuse at each other. With Steve, we disagree and we can actually address the evidence. We have that professional decorum, which is what I like about skeptics like Steve. So this is called The Moon Landings, a second reply to Steve Mumbling, because he has made a video, and I've been meaning to reply to Steve's videos for a couple of months. I haven't had time, so I'm sorry about that, everyone, and Steve especially, because he has gone to a lot of trouble to make various videos about various subjects. Now if I look a bit strange or look different from normal, I'm sort of lower down. All right. Now, what it is, I've got a new chair. Do you see it's got a back to it? Can you see the back to my chair? See, it's got a little back to my... You can't see it. I've got a new chair because my old one was a bit rubbish. It didn't have a proper back, so it was like a stool. I say it's a new chair. It was actually left outside someone's house, and I mean, in Oxford. I don't know if you do this sort of thing in all parts of wherever you live, but in Oxford, there's a kind of unspoken rule that if you leave something in your front garden or just outside in your front garden, it's basically there for someone to take. It's called free cycling, and I get a lot of stuff that way. It's quite a good way of getting some cheap furniture and cheap other things, and there's all kinds of things you get left out there, you know. So I picked up a chair. Now it's got some holes in it, in the cushion, and like padding, so it's leaking slightly. And it's only when I got home I realised, and this is often the case with free cycle, they very rarely throw things away which don't have something wrong with them. In this case, it won't go up. It's stuck at a low level. It'll go up, but then it just sort of sinks down slowly. So I'm a bit of a low level at the moment. All right, I'm going to see if I can find a solution to that. But for the time being, I'm just going to stick to what it is at the low level. All right. So yeah, we have Steve Mumbling. He's made a video called Debunking Marcus Allen's Fake Moon Landing Presentation, and of course this takes us back to Dreaming Saucers, because of course Marcus Allen in May spoke at Dreaming Saucers, and what Steve's done is he's basically made a review of Marcus's talk at Dreaming Saucers. So we're going to have like Steve explaining where Marcus went wrong, and so I'm now going to do a counter rebuttal to what Steve said in his reply to my video of Marcus Allen. It's getting complicated, isn't it? Now, this is a much more detailed video that Steve has done. It's much longer. It's an hour and 25 minutes. And he addresses many more points. Because if you remember from the first moon landing video, I'll put a link in the description box, both to the source video of Steve's, to Marcus's response, and to my previous moon landing video to Steve. Alright, that's the first moon landing reply video I did to Steve Mumbling. He covers a lot more points in this one, so it's a lot better, because I remember that in his first video, Steve only really covered, I think it was just one single point, which was, the Russians would have told everyone, you know, the Russians were watching and they could have found out and they could have proved the Americans wrong. Yes, so this is why this fake moon landing stuff is a steaming pile. Funnily enough, Steve thinks that I make him sound like an MG owner. He's a Holden owner, but he makes an MG. I don't know what MG owners sound like, actually. I mean, here in England they sound just like everybody else, but Steve has a Holden. He drives a Holden. Yeah, he's done a video about my voice. I think I sound very much like him, actually. So this is really quite, this is sort of a bit apt in a sense, because we are approaching what for NASA is very much an informational choke point, and that is the 50th anniversary of Apollo. Now, the first major anniversary comes up in December this year, where we have the 50th anniversary of Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was the first manned lunar mission. It was the first of there were two manned missions to the moon which did not involve a landing. That's Apollo 8, Apollo 10. Apollo 8 went around the moon, it orbited the moon in December 1980, and a lot of media attention. Obviously, this was eclipsed in July the following year with the landing of Apollo 11 of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. But I think the Apollo 8 situation is going to generate an awful lot of publicity, a lot of questions, and a lot of answers are going to be needed by NASA. And indeed, we already see a sign of this, because I actually covered something on a Panama Voice yesterday. Was it the day before? I can't remember. But Buzz Aldrin has allegedly confessed that they'd faked the moon landings. Now, I wrote an article on this because what it is Buzz Aldrin, who is actually talking to a young girl called Zoe, she's apparently, they say she's 8 years old, she's actually 6. He says at one point, "Oh, we didn't go, and we didn't go to the moon or something." Now, if you watch it, you'll find he doesn't actually say that, especially if you listen to his entire discussion with Zoe, because it's actually 20 minutes. It's just one little slot of a 20-minute interview. So Aldrin did not confess to faking the moon landings. Buzz Aldrin, though, he sounds, sadly, I'd say he's suffering from dementia of some kind. He talks very slowly, he sometimes trips over his words. And he's 88 years old, and unfortunately people of that age group often do suffer from some form of mental impairment. It's a sad fact. So he didn't confess, okay, but the very fact that this went viral, the conspiracy was buzzing about Buzz. So this went viral to the point where the mainstream media did a damage limitation operation on This Morning. They had, the TV show they had with Eamon Holmes and someone else, I can't remember. They changed the presenters every so often. It used to be Philip Schofield and Fern Britton, and now it's somebody else. I don't know. But anyway, on This Morning they had a debate between someone called Martin Kenny, who I've never heard of before, a young black chap, who is supposedly an Apollo hoax researcher. I've never seen the guy in my life, and I know everyone in this business. And he's debating with this sort of like female Professor Brian Cox type person. And what he says just makes no sense. He's a complete lightweight. And then, of course, that's why they got him on. And he also says something at the end which makes me think he's a flat earther. He talks about the moon being a luminary, and he says a couple of other things which I think indicate that he's a flat earther. So I mean, they could easily have had, if they wanted a proper debate, they could have had Marcus Allen on that show, or they could have had me, or Andrew Johnson, or Mary Bennett, or any of these other people who've actually looked into this in detail. We'd have done a much better job than Martin Flat Earth Kenny. But they didn't want anyone doing a good job. It was a hit piece. It was, as I said, it was a piece of counter-propaganda. So, so I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about several other things, because there's actually a new video come to light. It was actually made a couple of years ago, but it's just sort of like picking up now, called Make Believe. And this is a video which has a new analysis of the Apollo visual record. And it's narrated by someone who uses a voice modulator, which is so heavy that you can hardly hear what the person is saying. Yeah, this is because this person wants to protect their identity. And there's like an analysis video where they've kind of decoded it a bit and they've added captions to make it easier to understand. But once you can understand what the person is saying, it's a very, very good video indeed. It's 2.5 hours long, and it gives you an awful lot of information. And I'm glad I watched this just before I did this reply video to Steve. Now I'm going to go through Steve's video. I mean, like I said, I'm going to deal with the factual side of things. I don't bear Steve any ill will. In fact, someone on one of his videos suggested that Steve and I get together and have a pint in a pub, and I said I'm fine with that. I'm fine to socialise with the guy. Obviously he lives in Australia and I live in Britain, but we could go to a pub halfway, Madagascar. I'm quite happy to do that. Someone else suggests that Steve would be a good guest for her Panama Radio, and I agree. I'm quite happy to have him on as a guest if he wants to do that. Just send me your email, Steve, and we'll get in touch. Now we'll arrange that. Now Steve's video, as I said, I'm not going to repeat every minute of Steve's video. I'm not going to play you every minute of Steve's video because a lot of it is simply Marcus talking, which coming through the two being reproduced twice would be inaudible. So I'm not going to do that. And then I'm going to skip over some certain elements of the video where Steve repeats himself because he makes the same points twice or more times, over and over. I'm also going to eliminate what I consider is excessive rhetoric, and there's a lot of that in this particular video. I think Steve is unfair to Marcus Allen. He's very unfair to him. Things like that. So I'm going to do that. Okay. By the way, I hope you like the new lighting effects. I've actually got it's the sun shining just the right angle, so I've pulled the curtains back so there's light coming from the window. And there's a reason I've done that, and I'll explain why in a minute. All right. Oh, I'll explain later in the video. Okay, so I'm going to just go through Steve's video, and we're going to, and we will. I think I deal with Steve's points fairly. I haven't tried to censor him or mislead by selectively playing parts of his video and addressing parts of his video. I believe I've given Steve a fair hearing here. I have endeavoured to do that and remain factual. Okay, so the video starts with he puts a copyright disclaimer on here, which is like I do on some of my videos. But honestly, Steve, you should know me better than that. I'm not, because he is actually repeating some of the material on my channel, and so in a sense he's commenting. He's actually reproducing some of my material. Okay, but he's doing it under the fair use guidelines. And do you really think I'm going to sort of like false flag your video, Steve? Come on now, I'm not a scumbag like that. This is what the trolls do, and I'm not going to do that. Okay, so you don't need to actually put up a copyright disclaimer when you're using my material. You're quite at liberty to use any of my material under the Copyright Act of 1976. That is, in terms of fair use, that's absolutely fine with me. You can use any of my material for that purpose. All right, so don't worry about that in future. So he puts under this he puts up this copyright disclaimer first, and then
well, here we are. Here's Mr. Marcus Allen, who's appearing at the Ben Emlyn Jones Dreaming Saucers conference, if that's the right word.
Well, of course, it's a conference, Steve. It's I called it that, and that's what it is. Yeah, he's this is Marcus Allen speaking at Dreaming Saucers. It was a very, very good event. I'm very grateful to Marcus for appearing, and I do I wish him. I'm still in touch with Marcus. I'm hoping to get him back on a Panmo radio soon as well. So carry on, Steve.
It was held, I think, recently in Oxford. Last week, maybe the week before.
It was in Oxford, yes, in May the 13th and 14th.
I'll leave a link to this source video below. Dreaming Saucers, Marcus Allen. And now Marcus Allen is one of the people that has been spruiking this. The moon landing was faked.
I think spruiking is Australian for just speaking publicly. Can you hear me all right? Let me just check the volume, hang on.
For many years now.
Is that better?
And I think
it's almost on full volume.
He's got this sort of presentation, or he should have this presentation down pat.
Okay, I'm just going to move you forward like a little bit to the next point. Okay, because this is where he starts getting. Now I'm going to address some of Steve's rhetoric actually during the course of this video, because I think it does need to be spoken about. Here we go. Let's get in the right place.
By the time you finish watching this, I think you'll be convinced that this man has absolutely no credibility whatsoever.
Well, that's not an argument. Saying someone has no credibility is not proving that they have no credibility. This is like Stefan Molyneux says, and he's absolutely right. You need to demonstrate that he has no credibility by addressing his points. And okay, you do that, Steve. You address some of Marcus's points, and I will provide a counter rebuttal to what you say to Marcus's points. Indeed, actually, you do prove him wrong a couple of times. I'll admit that, and I'll explain the points where you do during the course of this video. But you saying someone has no credibility. You make a lot of other personal comments about Miles during the course of this screed of yours, this tirade, which I will also pull you up on.
What we saw was not what we were told.
Okay, that's Marcus talking now, which you can't really hear. Because Steve uses a camera screen over, when he does his videos, which is okay. I do that myself sometimes, but obviously it means that the actual the dialogue which Marcus is actually giving is inaudible, and it's pretty much inaudible. It'll certainly be inaudible to you, but obviously it's nothing. You can actually look at the source video. Also, Steve actually does explain what Marcus says. He provides a source link as well, so you can check that out.
Yes, of course it was. Just think for a minute. I don't know if you were around in 1969, but I was. It was on all the television channels. The mission was tracked by the English from Jodrell Bank.
Firstly, it's on all the television channels. As Bill Hicks says, we're the puppet people. Put it on our TV, it's true. Yeah, well, like, nothing false has ever been put on television before. I mean, are you saying that, Steve? Are you actually saying that something being on the news, on TV, everywhere, is proof of reality? There are numerous other examples I could give of where things have been widely broadcast and widely believed in the media, which are false. In fact, one of my principal aims in what I do with Hapanlo is to actually uncover those falsehoods. But you mentioned Jodrell Bank. I'll let you carry on.
Australians from Honeysuckle Creek and Parks would have been tracked.
He mentions Parks. Right, now, there's actually a film you can watch called The Dish. It's actually, I was lucky because it was released in 2000, and I happened to be in Australia at the time. I was visiting my brother, so I got to see it in the cinema before anyone else did. It's got Sam Neill and a couple of less well-known Australian actors. It's actually quite an amusing film. It's light-hearted, as Australian culture tends to be, and it is all about the role that the Parkes Observatory played in the Apollo missions. Now, the Parkes Observatory was jury-rigged and press-ganged into playing a role in capturing the transmissions from the Apollo 11 mission as when they were transmitted from the moon to Earth. And so this whole film is a kind of exercise in Aussie flag waving and unsung heroes, because they're saying, look, we are the people who got those TV transmissions from the moon. If it hadn't been for us Aussies here at the Parkes Observatory, no one would ever be able to see it. The thesis here which Steve is putting across, because of course Jodrell Bank have commented on this lots and lots of times. They tracked the Lunar module, they tracked the Apollo missions, is that because they tracked this spacecraft going to the moon, that proves that the Apollo missions were true. In other words, it proves that all the data that was coming from the moon, including the popular data, the TV, the transmissions, the astronauts speaking, all that had to come from the moon. Well, that I think is an assumption. All they tracked was a spacecraft which was transmitting material. It doesn't necessarily mean that material was actually being transmitted in the way that history says it was. In other words, this was the lunar module and the command module. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin were aboard, and they were transmitting signals. Now, I understand it's perfectly common sense to believe that's the case, because that's what you would expect if the moon landings were real. You would expect that. But when you bring in all the other evidence into account, plus all this material on the secret space program, and the ability to perform this hoax, I think you get a different picture. I think it would be fair to say that Jodrell Bank and Honeysuckle Creek and Parkes, they recorded transmissions from a spacecraft of some description, not necessarily a manned spacecraft, possibly just a radio relay device, which was basically mimicking the trajectory and actions of the Apollo missions as they were presented on TV. So I'll let him carry on.
Tracked by several other Earth stations around the world. It would have been tracked by the Russians. It would have been tracked by the Chinese. Everyone.
Yeah, of course, exactly. They were tracking this thing.
Would have been looking at this. Now he says, "Oh yes, well, it's later on somewhere here. I don't know whether I'll include the clip, but he actually says, oh yeah, the Russians wouldn't have spilled the beans because they were more interested in getting a gas pipeline contract signed to supply gas to Europe. Well, what's supplying gas to Europe got to do with America? He says that the space race wasn't real. It certainly was. You've got to bear in mind this was all done during the Cold War, and the Americans were getting left in the dust by the Russians.
Okay, I'm going to stop now because this is all material I cover on my first reply video to Steve Mumbling on the moon landings. There's a link in the description box to that. I'm not going to repeat myself now, but I do have an answer to the point Steve's made, which was, you know, this was the Cold War, this was the space race. The two superpowers were locked in competition. And the Russians at that time, for the first decade of the space race, the Soviets, they had a decisive lead. And America needed to catch up. They needed some big coup to catch up, some massive achievement in order to catch up and prove that they were the equals of the Russians in space. And of course the moon landings is the obvious answer to this, a manned moon landing. And they were seen to do that. And of course, because the Russians were locked in competition with the Americans so much, that if the Russians even suspected which something was wrong, which they must have done, because they were tracking the craft, they had the ability, they were the only other nation on Earth at that time, with the ability to actually verify the moon landings themselves, they would have done so, and if there had been any hint of deceit anywhere, they would have immediately let the cat out the bag, and they would have exposed this fake moon landings for all the world to see. Now, that's not true. I think, and Marcus has given one reason why he thinks that the Russians would have kept their mouths shut, and I give more, but I'm not going to repeat them now. Just go to the link in the description box where I address the point Steve makes here. So we'll just carry on to the next point of interest, which is, it's called, go a bit forward a bit to 4:45.
That's we're about to.
Oh, okay.
Marcus is holding up a copy of Nexus magazine.
Now, he is the publisher and distributor for Nexus magazine in the UK.
Yeah, that's right. I'll show you my copy, my latest copy. And here is the latest one. I'm a regular reader. I'm a regular subscriber, so there's my latest copy. There's an ad in there for my book, actually, which I've just put in. So, yeah, this is Nexus magazine, which is actually an Australian-based magazine, Steve. Yes, you should be proud of your nation, of yours. I know you're actually British by birth, but I know you live in Australia now, so I don't know if you're actually an naturalised Australian, but if you are, you should be very proud of your adopted nation for producing this. It's actually an Australian called Duncan Rhodes who actually founded this. It's been running now since the 1980s. It's like 30 years old. It's been going, and see, it's a very, very, very popular magazine. And I really, really like it. I think it's great. And Steve's going to tell us now, in no uncertain terms, why I shouldn't have those feelings for Nexus magazine.
I think it's big enough. So we're going to have a look at the special effects budget.
He doesn't, of course. He looks at the moon landing, which he considers footage of special effects, but he doesn't talk about the special effects budget. You've got to bear in mind that it was an awful lot of money. There were 400,000 people involved in Apollo. They all have to be in on.
Of course, there was a lot of money. I mean, there was. They actually allocated $20 billion for a Project Apollo, and they did have a large number of people. 400,000 at least. A huge number of people were involved in the Project Apollo. For the astronauts who actually went up there was only 12 altogether. There were thousands of people behind the scenes working hard and tirelessly to get this done. But only a small number would have needed to know in order to perpetrate a hoax and not really send the astronauts to the moon. And this is a point made by Bill Kaysing when he wrote the screenplay to the film, which was eventually plagiarised off him and was called Capricorn 1. This was a point made in that film Capricorn 1, which I do recommend that actually. It's about a fake Mars mission, which they have to say Mars. They can't make it too obvious by saying it's the moon. But do watch that if you get the chance. Yeah, again. We also come back to things such as the Milgram experiment, which I've discovered before, which is I think is a very, very good as I don't need to repeat it. I've described the Milgram experiment many times, but it is a perfect illustration about how human beings are naturally cohesive in terms of hierarchy. Which what I mean is that in the presence of an authority figure, we tend to simply obey. Which means that we naturally fall into power structures and collectives, which I think is actually essential because we are a social species. It's like many other animals. We live in large groups. There'll be someone will rise to the top and become the leader, and in order to make the group function as a whole. You see the same with dogs, with wolves, and other creatures like that. We're exactly identical. The problem is that it means that if a malevolent force emerges into human society which wants to actually do harm, it's quite easy for that malevolent force to co-opt large numbers of people, even 400,000 people, into obeying, into going into collaborating, even if only tacitly, even if only subconsciously, into collaborating. And this doesn't include the people who need not know anything, who need know absolutely nothing. A perfect example for this is the Manhattan Project, the plot to build the first atomic bomb. It had a similar budget and similar team, a large number of people working on it. There was a guy called Robert Oppenheimer, who was the leader. And interestingly, he was into Aleister Crowley and stuff like that. That was very interesting. But even this guy called Jack Parsons, who was like a Crowley type person. But anyway, I digress. Oppenheimer was the designer. There was a design team on this bomb, which is based on the work of Albert Einstein and E = mc squared and energy from matter and stuff like this. And large numbers of people were building the bomb they dropped on Hiroshima. A large number of people. There was several factories were making components of the bomb, but they were a long way away from each other. The teams deliberately compartmentalized the construction and design process by having people in very, very, very far away from each other, as far away from each other as possible. People who didn't know each other work on different elements of the design and the construction. So it was only the people who were at the centre of the web who actually knew how these different elements fitted together, which meant that they could actually eventually construct an entire nuclear bomb, which they detonated in the Trinity test site, and later they detonated two over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thus ending World War II. There's so many people didn't know. I mean, the pilots of one of the planes, he didn't know what kind of ordnance he was delivering to the enemy, and he was so horrified actually by what he'd been a part of, what he'd done, that when he got back to base, he deserted and then ended up in a monastery. So there's so many people had to be involved. It's this saying that is an assumption that everyone is divided into two parts: people who are knowing malicious perpetrators, and others who are unknowing and completely ignorant tools of those perpetrators. But that's not true. It's far more complicated than that. I've done an article on this, actually. I've done an article on this as a reply to an Oxford statistician who actually tried to make this point. But that's probably something I'll have to cover in an entire different video.
The hoax, or the fake, it's ridiculous beyond words. But anyway, this guy is the publisher and distributor of Nexus magazine.
That's right, Marcus is. He's the UK publisher and distributor of Nexus magazine. That's right, that's his job. That's what he does.
Which is one of these alternative codswallop magazines, you know.
Alternative codswallop magazines, right? Well, it's just the alternative magazine. Yes, it covers a number of subjects here: vitamin C, scurvy and burns, heart disease, the real cause, scientific evidence for spiritual healing, ancient Australia and India at war, prophecies coming from Earth changers, beyond Einstein, a new theory of relativity, were the gods extraterrestrial? Yeah, these are subjects. There's a lot of information in this magazine, Steve, an awful lot. And simply calling it a codswallop magazine puts a label on it, which means you can, in a sense, put it within these brackets, codswallop. It means you don't have to address any of the points it makes. See, it's a way of sidestepping the issue, which is what you're doing.
They say things like free energy is real, 9/11 was a hoax. You know.
Yeah, free energy is real. 9/11 was a inside job. I mean, I've talked about with you about this, and indeed Nexus magazine covers it, and I've explained to you why I think it's true. If you call something, well, yes, okay, you have this argument, this hypothesis, and I think you're wrong because Codswallop. That is anti-logical. It is counter-intellectual on the most extreme kind.
Sort of rubbish. And these sort of magazines, because none of this stuff is real.
It is real, and you need to explain. I have to explain to you why it's real. That's why the whole purpose of these reply videos to you is explain why it is real.
Magazines have to come up with these stories to sell magazines.
Now, this is where the ad hominem rhetoric comes about. You are suggesting, and you say this several times in the course of the video, that people who do these sort of things, who produce magazines like Nexus, actually concoct falsehoods to fill their pages and sell the magazine. That's what you're saying. You're saying this is essentially a kind of pseudo-fiction, which is simply not true, because I can explain to you why these things are real. If I can't do that, then you'd have a point. But I can, and I do. This is very unfair of you, what you're saying. I think it's unpleasant what you're doing by attacking Marcus. And you do several times in this video. You attack Marcus personally, and you attack his integrity. You accuse him of lying. And I'll come across some other examples, and I think that's disreputable of you, Steve. I expect better from you.
And they just invent all this ridiculous rubbish. Anyway, he's going to tell us about Nexus magazine.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next point of interest, which is we go forward to 9:52. Sorry, I've made notes of the interesting points. So I think I am treating Steve fairly here.
I haven't covered Apollo 13, which was actually the capsule came down in the Atlantic, which was recovered.
We're talking now about Apollo 13, about the moon mission. Which interesting is Apollo 13 is the only one of all the lunar missions in which there were 6 lunar missions where there was any major malfunction. That's the only one. I mean, that is a success record which is unprecedented in all of space exploration, because I mean, up to I think between 60 and 70% of all space missions through history have experienced partial or total failure. Now, when it comes to manned missions, there's no such thing as a partial failure. You know, any kind of failure can usually result in the deaths of the crew. And with Apollo 13, they were incredibly fortunate to survive, if it was real. Now, Marcus is going to just tell us a story now about Apollo 13 and the capsule when it did get back to Earth safely.
Apollo 13 going down in the Atlantic, picked up by the
Steve can hardly talk through his hilarity, but what he's saying is that the Apollo 13 capsule came down in the Atlantic Ocean and was basically... I'll let him explain what happens next when he gets over his laughter. This is like comedy for Steve, I think. It is, isn't it, Steve? You just think this is just funny.
It's now on display in the Museum of Kansas. You haven't heard that story?
Haven't heard that story because it's ridiculous, bloody rubbish. He probably made it up in the car park.
Right, see, it's more... this is more a rhetoric against Marcus. Steve accuses Marcus of all kinds of things. He accuses Marcus of basically lying, of making the whole thing up. He says that Marcus actually knows that the moon landings were real, but he says he doesn't, so that he can make money, so that he can like tour the world and speak at conferences like Dreaming Saucers. And Steve has no evidence for accusing Miles of Marcus of lying. He just says it. Now I'll come on to that at the end, actually, because I'll come on to that at the very end of this video.
No.
You thought nothing.
I'll go forward a bit because Steve's just laughing now.
Rubbish that's in the magazine that he's trying. Alrighty, this one's going to be inserted, I think. America and work on the American space program.
Oh, I'm going to go back. Hang on. Yeah, let's go back slightly. Now, what this is about? All right, I can't find it. Steve, I don't think Steve is coherently actually explaining exactly what this is. Is that Marcus said that the Apollo 13 capsule came down the Atlantic Ocean and was actually rescued by the Russians. The Soviet icebreaker actually picked it up, and then that's what happened, because the Apollo 13 capsule actually went off course. Now it turns out that's actually, according to what I've seen, that's actually not true. Steve actually provides a link to this, even though he can't stop laughing to actually explain it. He provides a link here because it's astronautics.com, and it's on this website here, astronautics.com. Soviet Apollo capsule. Now what happens is the Soviet Union did actually recover an Apollo capsule, but this was actually before. This was in 1970, but it was before Apollo 13. It was Apollo 13 was 1970. This was in 1966 during the planning of Apollo, where they were actually training. They were training with capsules, with actually because of course the Apollo capsule lands in the sea. It actually lands in the sea as close as possible to a ship which is ready to pick it up, which is quite hazardous in itself, because if you land in the sea, there's certain things you have to do, like there has to be like a flotation belt around the bottom of the capsule, which has to deploy and fill with air to keep the capsule afloat. Otherwise it'll just sink and everyone will drown, which is, of course, that would be a pretty awful thing, to fly all the way back from the moon just to land in the sea and then sink to the bottom of the sea and drown. So they went through an awful lot of training and an awful lot of design to get these Apollo capsules to know what they were doing when they were landing in the sea. Now, one did go off course. It landed in the wrong place, and it was picked up by the Soviets, who they actually did return it to the Americans. They went to a place in Iceland, and they transferred it to the U.S. Coast Guard. But this was in 1966, so it was many years before Apollo, and it was Apollo capsule 1227, which is now, interestingly, this was actually taken. It was a museum piece for a while, and it was actually sealed now. It's covered with a wrapper at Grand Rapids, Michigan, USA, and it's a time capsule. They put something in it which is not going to be opened until the year 2076, which is the United States tricentennial. It's 300 years that the country has existed. They've had their bicentennial 1976, because the country was founded in 1776. The answer to 1984 is 1776, as Alex Jones says. They had their centennial. 1876 was the centenary, and then 1976 the bicentenary. 2076 will be the tricentenary, and that's when it will be open. I wonder what's inside. Probably some documents proving that Apollo was faked. They're probably the old camera footage or director's clapperboard or something. Yeah. Oh. Interestingly, talking about the clapperboard, that famous thing I said, the make-believe video I was talking about, right? The reason the person is said supposedly uses such a harsh modulator, so you can hardly hear them speaking, is because they're Donald Trimble. Donald Trimble was a director of photography for several films with Stanley Kubrick. Now, I don't believe Stanley Kubrick was directly involved with Apollo. I don't think he would have done that. It's a big subject, but Carl James thinks otherwise. I mean, it's a big subject now. I won't go into that. But that's just one of the theories behind the person who created the make-believe video. Anyway, so it looks as if Steve is actually correct, and Marcus may have made a mistake here regarding Apollo 13, unless this is a piece of disinformation. I'm sure Marcus will correct me if that's the case. But the point is, it's a pretty minor issue, and it's pretty irrelevant, actually, to Marcus's entire case. So Steve may have proved Marcus wrong here, but he's nitpicking. He does that again, actually. I'll go forward.
Okay, on with the next one. Okay, now here, Mr.
Okay, right. Where are we now? 12:29. That's right. Slightly.
Okay, now here Mr. Allen is going to tell us that about Operation Paperclip, where the Americans managed to get some of the German rocket scientists to go and live in America and work on the American space program.
They did indeed. Werner von Braun and Hermann Oberth, several others they were the Nazi scientists. They built the V2 rockets, which had devastated London in the war, killed many innocent people. The Saturn V, which is the Apollo rocket, is based on that design of that liquid-fueled ballistic missile, the V2 program.
These, of course, are real rocket engineers and scientists. They're not special effects people. If you're going to,
it doesn't. The point Steve's making here is that well, that proves that the Apollo mission had to be real because real rocket scientists worked on it and not special effects people from the movie industry. Like as if no real rocket was actually built. Of course, real rockets were built. I'm not pretending, and Marcus is not pretending, that the Saturn V launch vehicle was a fake rocket. It was something from a movie set. No, it was a real rocket. It was perfectly capable of launching a capsule and a payload into low Earth orbit, and indeed it did. I believe it did launch a payload capsule, possibly a manned mission. Possibly there were real astronauts in the capsule. Maybe even the named astronauts. It also was used to launch things such as Skylab and things like that, which was like a space station, a bit like the ISS. So I'm not pretending that there wasn't a real rocket. Of course there were real rockets, and they needed these guys to build them, these Germans. So that's true, but that's not the point. It doesn't mean they didn't. It doesn't mean that once the rocket was in space, all the rest was real. It doesn't mean that they didn't need these guys to help design these rockets.
Fake it, you're not going to need real rocket engineers, are you?
Of course you are, so I explain why.
You know, von Braun is not known for his special effects prowess.
Oh, this is a complete diversion, as I've explained.
And I think this is quite interesting. Just listen to what he says here. Listen closely to what he says about von Braun and co.
Operation Paperclip because a new description of the Nazi scientists imported into America had a new CV paperclipped onto their visa application.
That is said to be where it comes from. That the paperclip was basically the thing that was put onto their documents. It was basically to absolve them from all war crimes. Okay, I'm just going to have to change the film chip. Back in a moment. Okay, I'm back. Right, I've actually lifted. This is the problem with this chair. Don't worry, this chair. You'll see me slowly descend in the next few minutes because this chair does that. But this is the problem with it. I've raised it up now, so it's a bit too high. But anyway, I'm back. So we're going to continue with the thing about Marcus.
Say that they were good people and they were Nazis. They were Nazis.
Yeah, this is Operation Paperclip still. Yeah, because that's right. They had their war crimes record completely deleted. They were basically given immunity from prosecution. These were guys who, a lot of others who didn't have the skills that the Allies needed, went to Nuremberg and to the gallows.
Werner von Braun was a major in the SS.
If you can hear that, Werner von Braun was a major in the SS.
Oberth was a senior scientist. They were all Germans who got America to the moon.
Germans got America to the moon. Here I go.
Did you hear what he said? He said they're all Germans that got America to the moon.
Well, is that false? I mean, it's true that, of course, the United States had its own scientists and many kinds, but the Apollo mission was very much an international effort, and of course, the Germans, in the form of the Nazi rocket scientists, were absolutely crucial. They were crucial in that. People like von Braun were absolutely crucial to that design work, and I can imagine what Michael Shrimpton makes of that. But to be fair, I mean, so the Russians also used their fair share of Nazi scientists. I mean, the division of the spoils at the end of World War II, after the destruction of Nazi Germany, is a story in itself. But basically, the Soviets got their share of the scientists too, as did the British. And these guys were offered no choice. So those who said, well, they would never have agreed to work for the Soviets because they were, the Nazis were totally against the communists. Well, they weren't given any choice. They were told, work for us or go to Nuremberg. which would mean certain death. It's true. I mean, it was a combined effort. I mean, they had their own, like the Russians had their own version. They had their own version of von Braun, Sergei Korolyov, but they had help from the Nazis. Indeed, in many different ways. I mean, it wasn't just rocketry; it was many other things as well, and including things to do with the secret space program. And well, that's not me farting. That's the chair going down. So, yeah. What Marcus says is actually not false at all. So I'll just see what Steve has to say.
They're all Germans that got America to the moon. He knows very well that the Americans went to the moon. There's 2 or 3 of these Freudian slips through this presentation, and of course,
yeah. Well, that's not a Freudian slip. He does make one, but that's not one.
I'll jump on every one that I've noticed. If you've noticed any more, let me know.
But you won't provide any evidence. You're making accusations against Marcus's character, which are completely unfounded, because you have no evidence to say this. You can disagree with him if you like, Steve. That's fine. But to say he's a bad person who's making it all up is a very serious matter, and you should not be saying these things about Marcus without any evidence. Okay, so let's move on to the next bit. Where are we? I should point out Marcus, yeah, because Steve, actually, this is something Steve said earlier on about Marcus when he was talking about Nexus, when Marcus was promoting Nexus. He basically said, oh look, Marcus is just flogging he's hawking his stupid piece of Codswallop magazine, and it's all a big money-making scam for him. I've known Marcus for many years. He's an honest man, and he believes in what he says and what he promotes in the magazine. Whether you agree with him or not, if you think he's wrong, then fine. But explain why he's wrong. Don't just say he's wrong because he's a bad guy and he's lying and he's talking Codswallop to make money. Marcus had a very successful corporate career. He worked for Toyota. He was a trained photographer. Do you not think that he could have, if he wanted to make money, he could have stuck on that career path? Don't you think he could have done that? Don't you think he would have done that? It's odd that these skeptics who keep accusing people on our side, the woo-woos so-called, of just being in it for the money, it's a convenient way to, it's a very intellectually dishonest way of ad hominem, making an ad hominem attack against our character to avoid addressing our points. You know, David Icke apparently he did what he did for the money. Yeah, he lost his job at the BBC. He lost a job where, you know how much those guys get paid, TV presenters. He lost his job at the BBC to do this. He basically traded that in. He got himself sacked basically to do what he was doing. And for many years he was making nothing. I asked you please to think twice before making these accusations, Steve, because it doesn't do you any credit to do so. It's not Marcus here who he's being slandered here. You're slandering yourself by simply using this tactic.
I'll make some more clips and maybe redo the video and insert them as well. So this is the Ben Emlyn Jones Dreaming Sources Marcus Allen presentation.
Yeah, I was very proud of Dreaming Sources. I was very proud of what I did. I was very proud of having Marcus as a speaker. And not only do I not apologise for having Marcus as a speaker, I'm very grateful to him for speaking, and I endorse what he was saying at the conference. With the exception of a couple of mistakes he made, I think what he said was correct.
15 minutes and 17 seconds, and he's just said Operation Paperclip. They've got the Nazi scientists, von Braun and co. Remember he was talking about special effects and faking it earlier. These are not special effects people, these are rocket scientists.
Okay, I'm going to move forward. Steve's repeating himself there. Okay, so we'll move forward to this next bit here. Okay.
Clip there. Not looking good for Mr. Allen so far, is it?
Okay, you may recall a gentleman by the name of Carl Sagan, who was
Carl Sagan, he's now going to bring up the Carl Sagan quote.
a very good communicator, and he popularised one particular phrase.
Very good astrophysicist as well, wasn't he, Carl Sagan?
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary explanations or evidence. That's true. Now I've made I addressed this in my skeptic video, and I've put a link in the description box to that, where I basically think when the skeptics say that, I think that's not true. I think it's a bad way of describing it. But I know what Marcus means by this, and I know why people use it. And I know their motivations behind it. But what he's saying is that for something as incredible as landing astronauts on the moon, there needs to be proportional evidence to justify belief in that actually happened. And that's true.
Yes, they do. It's a phrase that I've used a few times, and Ben Emlyn Jones actually doesn't like that phrase. He thinks that phrase is hilarious.
Oh, yes, I explain exactly why I think generally it shouldn't be used. I think the skeptics make a mistake by keeping on using it all the time.
He doesn't actually sort of laugh at Mr. Allen, though, does he? He doesn't say to...
No, because I think Marcus is... Well, I explained what I mean. I think, obviously, I don't like that phrase, and I wouldn't use it, but I know what Marcus means by it, and I know what people mean when they say it. I just think it's often misused by the skeptics.
Mr. Allen, oh, not that old chestnut.
That's another skeptic cliche, that old chestnut again.
I don't hear Ben making a fuss about that at all. I think it's a perfectly sensible statement.
I think what it is, the skeptics just laugh whenever it's good to be open-minded, but not so open-minded your brain falls out. You just say that in front of a load of skeptics, and they still laugh at it. Neil deGrasse Tyson said that just a couple of years ago, and he got a laugh from the audience. It's just saying skeptics, they like reusing old jokes. That was my point. Okay, going to move on slightly because I think that's the. Let me just check. That's the.
Which is a very sensible thing to say.
Yeah, exactly.
So what we're going to look at,
but Mr. Jones doesn't agree with that, of course.
Is some of the claims for the moon landings, because in the moon landings there are many strange anomalies, inconsistencies and unexplained details.
In his opinion.
Well, I think he provides a scientific treatise about that. It's not just his opinion, it's evidence.
We're going to be having a look at some of that. Because if this was the event we're told...
I think we'll move on now. Basically, you can watch that if you want to watch it. I'll go forward to the next part. Here we go. Right. Now, it's evidence. See, Marx is presenting evidence here. Now, either he's right or he's wrong. If he's wrong, explain why he's wrong. And you do. And I think in most cases, you're wrong about your explanation for what Marcus says. But it's simply to say it's not just an opinion. It's evidence. Evidence can be right or wrong. But an opinion is something different. Opinion is internal.
Yuri Gagarin orbiting the moon.
Not that though. That is a Freudian slip. That's just a little mistake that I don't even know. I don't know why I even made a note to point that out. Marcus talks about Yuri Gagarin orbiting the moon. Yuri Gagarin in April of 1961 orbited the Earth, but that's just someone tripping over their words. I mean, I do that sometimes. I mean, I sometimes watch my video and I think, oh damn it, I got that wrong. I shouldn't have said that. You see what I mean? It's something everybody does. Why are you making a big deal out of this, Steve? Why are you making a big deal? Let's go forward to the next bit. Right, 2029. Okay.
This made the Americans very nervous. And the Americans had to ramp up their space program.
All right, yeah. This is to do with the missiles. Now, because when Sputnik went up in 1957, there was a big hoo-ha in America because they suddenly realised not only was Russia way ahead in the space race and it had basically got off to a sterling advancement over its rival, but that these rockets that could launch satellites into space would make very, very good delivery mechanisms for strategic nuclear weapons. And so everyone was really frightened by that. And of course, what you want to understand about the Cold War is it was essentially a public relations exercise. It was I go into more detail in my previous video about the moon landings to Steve, my previous reply video. But it was essentially a psychological warfare operation which both sides exploited. It was in the interest of both sides that the Cold War. So in a sense, there was a cooperation between them in that sense. That the need to use it as a political tool, and nothing. The centre of this Cold War political fear tool was the nuclear bomb. And once Russia had this ability to launch missiles, people said, well, you could easily turn this into a missile and you could fire nuclear weapons at the United States. That's true. So America immediately responded by designing its own missiles. And this goes on to today. I mean, this resulted in the nuclear missile standoff, which includes the Minuteman missile and the SS-20, and today Trident, the submarine-launched nuclear weapon. Things like that. So that's basically the source of it all. Okay, that's what happened. And the thing is, that was very useful for both sides in the Cold War, to use it as a political tool. I'll go into details perhaps in a future video. It's a big subject.
So that they could at least match that capability. If you can put a man in orbit, you can deliver a warhead anywhere on the planet. Is basically the bottom line there. The space race was very real.
America and Soviet Union time were cooperating.
Right, yeah, he's saying that the American and Soviet Union were cooperating. Now, this is actually a subject I address in more detail in my first moon landings reply video to Steve. But they did. There was cooperation. Several researchers, including G. Edward Griffin and Anthony Sutton, have uncovered further cooperation between the superpowers during the Cold War, which is below the horizon of mainstream politics. But even on an overt level, you could see that they were playing each other off, and they were both gaining something from these standoffs. For instance, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Steve's now showing the slide which Mark has put up. There's a cartoon of President Kennedy and President Khrushchev having an arm wrestle while sitting on some bombs. That's a cartoon from a newspaper. Yes, indeed. I mean, there was this struggle between them, but it was a very carefully balanced struggle, which again brings us into the reason why the Russians wouldn't blow the whistle on the moon landings. And it was, in a sense, a symbiotic relationship, not just a competitive one, because they they gained the Cold War. The elites of the nations, whether it was the socialist East or the capitalist West, gained something from the Cold War. They both used it and exploited it, and both advanced considerably their own agendas as a result of it. So yes, there was cooperation, Steve.
No, they weren't.
Yes, they were.
In the 60s was the height of the Cold War, and I mean, if you look at this is a demonstration of the press telling everyone there was a space race on, and that's because there was a space.
They wanted people to see this as a huge competition. They wanted people to not kick up a fuss when $20 billion was allocated to the Apollo program. Now, this was exactly the same position in the Soviet Union, because in the Soviet Union, the space program of the Soviet Union was equally expensive. And this was in a country you had to queue 3 hours for a loaf of bread sometimes. Indeed, there was poverty in the United States. In fact, there was terrible poverty in both countries. And people would have asked questions. Indeed, there's that Whitey on the Moon rap tune about all this sort of thing, about the fact that the government was able to allocate this massive budget to putting rockets into space, while there was people living on the streets and living in terrible conditions in the downtown suburban areas of American cities? You know, couldn't those funds have been spent on public welfare programs instead? Things like that. Well, once you get people in a state, we have to beat the Russians, we have this Cold War, we have this space race, we have to beat them to the moon. People are not going to, are less likely to kick up a fuss about it. I think if you took that element out of it, that competitive element out of the equation, I doubt if rockets would even got off the ground. It's really quite simple, Steve. Actually, there's many textbooks and things you can read about this. I'm really surprised you don't seem to be aware of this.
Space race on. If you look at that picture there, you know, Kennedy and Khrushchev arm wrestling there. Do you think they? Do you get the impression they're cooperating? Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it very nearly led to World War III.
Yeah, that scared people. I mean, that was really terrifying, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah, that's, yeah. I mean, but both sides came out of it with a lot of benefits. Actually, there was an awful lot of. I mean, you could say technically the Americans won that one because Khrushchev blinked. You know, there was that famous eyeball to eyeball thing. But in a way, both sides won and both sides lost, and both gained.
Where the Americans blockaded, or quarantined, I think was the word they used, Cuba, because Russia was setting up
a blockade
ballistic missiles on Cuba with nuclear warheads to wipe out America. This man has no idea. They were not cooperating.
I think he does, see. I think Marcus does. I think Marcus is, you know, he could have gone into it in more detail, but he only had an hour and a bit on stage. I only allocated an hour and a quarter for every speaker, and that included Q&As. So obviously he had to pray-see this issue, but I think Marcus does understand that. You know, we're going to go forward. Where are we now? Right. Going to go forward a bit now. So 2059, that's done. 2023. Okay, I'm going to go forward a bit to the next point of interest. Right, now this is a picture. I'm not going. There's so many pictures here I could show you. I'm not going to. I'm actually going to show you this picture now. Okay, so just let you know what Steve's point is. That's the picture I wanted to show you. Okay, so
not only is Apollo fake, Gemini's faked as well. Everything's fake.
Right, what Steve's. I'm not going to rewind and replay what he said before, but basically you have here the Gemini capsule. This was another space program where there were two astronauts on a rocket went into low Earth orbit, and it came back the same way. They're landing in the sea, and you see this picture that Marcus shows, and I'll just let Steve explain it. That's basically what the picture was.
Of course, it's got to be. It sells magazines, doesn't it? You know,
oh, shut up, Steve. Honestly, please give that a rest now.
Not a bit of drama, a bit of intrigue. You know, no one's going to buy these bloody magazines. He peddles they're full of all this sort of twaddle.
First it's codswallop, now it's twaddle.
Okay, well, if you look at the diameter of the Gemini capsule, we can only see a little bit of it here, so it's less than half of it. And you look at the length of that up to the first point there. This is telescopic. Be a smaller section there. This would have been in here. And when the thing touched down in the water, this would have popped off. This would have telescoped out like that. And probably would have been a little radio beacon so they could locate it, maybe a comms antenna so they could actually talk to the aircraft carrier. There's no anomaly in that.
Well, actually, this is somewhere where Steve is right. Okay, this picture Marcus showed, and he said that what you saw, the big antenna sticking out of the capsule, would have been burnt off in re-entry. But what it is actually a communications antenna and a beacon, which the astronauts attached to the outside of the craft after it landed in the sea. It made it easier for them to be found, because of course it's very important if you're going to have these splashdowns in the sea. It's very important that the ship's nearby, because they don't know exactly where you're going to land, because you're coming down from space. So there's like a patch of area, maybe 100 square miles, where you could come down. So they have helicopters on standby to immediately go and recover the capsule and rescue the astronauts as soon as it landed, because it was a rescue, because they were in this capsule floating in the middle of the sea. And anything could have happened. I mean, the flotation system could have failed, a storm could have brewed up and hit them, or anything could have happened to actually, for this mission to end in disaster with the astronauts drowning after flying up into space and coming back again. So it was important they did have some form of communication. So that is actually, I think, a communications antenna. So this is a mistake Marcus made, which Steve has spotted, but I think this is one or two occasions where Steve actually proves Marcus wrong, the other being the Apollo 13 thing. And it is, in a sense, this is completely irrelevant. It's actually parallel to the point that Marcus is making about the moon landings anyway. So, and I think this is nitpicking. This is actually pointing out mistakes Marcus has made that are corollary to the entire case that Marcus is making, Steve. So you haven't, by pointing this out, you haven't diminished Marcus's case. You haven't dismissed Marcus's case in any way at all. So that's basically, I think it's time to move on to the next bit. Okay, right, I'm going to go forward a few minutes now to Neil Armstrong's grave. Okay, 2650. It's a long. This is going to be a long video. Sorry about that. I want to cover Steve fairly as I can now.
Off the spacecraft is the water. Perfectly logical, perfectly understandable. No anomaly at all.
Neil Armstrong died in 2012.
Neil Armstrong died 2012, Marcus is saying.
Neil Armstrong is probably the most famous American of the 20th century. Where is he buried? Arlington National Cemetery, you would expect, wouldn't you?
Marcus is saying he's buried in Arlington National Cemetery, but let's just see where he's buried actually. Sorry, I should look this up before. Neil Armstrong's grave. And here we are. It is in Neil Armstrong. He was buried at sea, and there is a memorial stone for him, but he was actually buried at sea. Yeah, that's find a grave. Neil Armstrong. No, oh, hang on. What's this say? Birth. It says Wikipedia, County, Ohio. Burial, cremated. Cremated. Sorry. Cremated remains committed to the sea in the Atlantic Ocean by his widow off the ship USS Philippine Sea. Right. So he died in Cincinnati, Ohio. Born and died in Ohio. And yeah, so he was cremated and buried at sea. That's it. Right. He was at the age of 82 on the 25th of August, and 2012 when he died. Well, yeah. So let's just carry on here. Okay.
Well, I wouldn't expect anything. I would expect him to be buried where he told his family he wished to be buried. Where's he going?
That's actually true. Obviously the deceased has the choice of where they want to be buried, and I know that when Winston Churchill died, people were calling for him to be interred at Westminster Abbey along with all the greats like Isaac Newton and people like that, because he was considered the greatest Prime Minister in history. And he wanted to be buried in the Spencer family plot at Blaydon, which is just down the road from me, actually, just a few miles away from where I am in Oxfordshire. And he's got a very modest grave, actually. I've been to see it, and indeed I think I filmed it for my Blenheim Palace video. It's just outside Blenheim Palace, where Trump stayed when he was here, if you remember that video. Yeah, that was the live stream, wasn't it? Yeah. So, yeah, Armstrong chose to have this rather modest send-off, and he wasn't buried in Arlington National Cemetery, which is the equivalent of Westminster Abbey for famous Americans. John F. Kennedy's buried there, all the others. That was his choice, and I'll just let Steve carry on.
And with this.
That's where prominent Americans are buried. Presidents and such like. No, he's buried at sea. That's the coast of Florida. He's a naval pilot, and maybe it's reasonable it should be buried.
Yes, Steve, he was a naval pilot. Yes, Neil Armstrong was a US Navy pilot, and he served in the Korean War, which may be what influenced his decision.
It seems a bit odd.
No, not really. Yeah, he was in the Navy. I can understand him wishing to be buried at sea. The other aspect of that, of course, is that, as he's just said, Neil Armstrong, very famous guy, first man to walk on the moon. the family may not have wanted him buried in a cemetery somewhere because people, you know, from the general public will go to look at the grave.
It's true actually that Armstrong was an extremely private individual. He's very shy. He did a few interviews which are very revealing. Richard D. Hall has just produced some programs which cover the interviews that Neil gave, which are quite, he's had them analysed, which is not hard to do actually, because he gave very few public speeches following the moon missions. And that's true. He was this sort of like quite retiring guy. He went back to teaching engineering at university and things like that. He avoided the public He avoided the public limelight very, very much. Now, I'll let Steve carry on because he brings up a sort of extra point here.
And you know, I think Neil Armstrong was a very private guy, wasn't he? I think maybe the family just didn't like the idea. He may very well have said, look, you know, I don't want people coming and sitting around the headstone and all this sort of stuff, that people that I don't know. You know, if you wanted to come and see the headstone and put some flowers on it, you might not be able to get to it because there'd be half a dozen people sitting around it. I think that's perfectly understandable. I think they buried Osama bin Laden at sea, didn't they, for the same reason? They did.
Oh right, well, Osama bin Laden. Okay, I'm not going to go into this area because there's so many anomalies about the death and burial of Osama bin Laden, which I've covered previously, and I've written an article about it, and I think I've mentioned it on previous videos, but it's completely and utterly, it stinks to high heaven of being fabricated. But I think Steve's point about Neil Armstrong is correct. And again, though, it doesn't really affect the actual thesis that Marcus is putting across. It has no bearing on whether or not the moon landings were real, which is the point of this particular video and the point of Marcus's lecture. So I'm just going to move on. I'll leave the bin Laden stuff alone because I could go on for that forever. Okay, 2912. Here we go. Go forward just a little bit.
Because he's an astrophysicist and he knows all about travelling through space and travelling through. No anomaly there. I don't think that's odd at all.
I've got the notes.
Don't put some flowers on it. You might not be able to get to it because there'll be half a dozen people sitting around it. I think that's perfectly understandable. I think they buried Osama bin Laden at sea, didn't they, for the same reason. They didn't want a physical spot on the planet anywhere where people could go and look at a headstone.
Hands up who believes the official story of bin Laden.
I don't think that's odd at all.
Maybe I'm just being a bit cynical. But if I do appear cynical and sarcastic, it's because I have. We have been fooled.
Yeah.
He left out Gormless there.
Shut up, Steve.
Humans cannot travel beyond the radiation.
Alright, I know where I am now. Sorry, my notes were sort of like messed up. Marcus just says humans cannot travel beyond low Earth orbit, beyond the Van Allen belts. Okay, well, that outside the secret space program, perhaps, but that's again, once I start on the secret space program, it brings in too much extra complications, and this video is going to be long enough as it is.
And he knows this, of course, because he's an astrophysicist.
Now, you're being sarcastic, Steve. Now, Marcus, as I said, is a trained photographer. He's studied this in detail. Yes, okay, maybe he's not an astrophysicist, but then, again, this is an ad hominem. This isn't ad hominem. This is saying, basically, if you could discredit the individual, you don't have to address the point they make. And yet, this is what you're doing with Marcus. You do this continuously throughout this video. It's very annoying, and I mean, it's very unfair on Marcus, and I don't like hearing him spoken about like this. If you think Marcus is wrong, explain why. But I can tell you, from someone who knows Marcus, I find him to be a man of great honesty and enormous. He's a likeable, honest, trustworthy chap. I've known him for many years, personally. You know, he's not just someone I look at on TV. And if you think he's incorrect, you could explain why he's incorrect. And this is what you are doing in this video. So why do you insert these snide little comments on top of that? Why?
And he knows all about travelling through space and travelling through radiation and cosmic rays in space. Oh, he's not an astrophysicist. I mean, he knows nothing whatsoever about it. This is just...
oh, I've had enough of this. I'm moving forward to the next point, which is... Right. I think we're going to get onto something a bit more factual, which will be a relief, quite frankly. Here we go.
Photograph the rubbish bag and this is a sequence of photographs.
Right, now, this is more interesting now. Marcus is talking about the photographs on the lunar surface, including the first few photographs which were taken on the moon, which are actually the most interesting. They record Buzz Aldrin exiting the lunar module and climbing down the ladder onto the moon's surface. And there are a series of photographs which you see him coming out of the hatchway of the lunar module from the very, very small compartment inside. Quite amazing actually when you can see, as Jim Collier has pointed out, when you see the actual size of the lunar module and inside, you can imagine how on earth did they get those big spacesuits on? Because I mean they're literally about the size of a toilet cubicle on a coach. They're really, really small, and there's seats and there's some control panels. The hatchway is underneath the control panel. There's some storage spaces for the helmets and the spacesuits and the backpacks underneath the seat. How on earth did they achieve this? And I mean, you can actually see Aldrin squeezing through this. I think it's a 33-inch hatch to get down get out of the actual LEM. And you think to yourself, how on earth did he put these on? I mean, there's a James Blish, the famous TV scientist. There's a TV show, you could see, well, it's not a TV, it's an old TV show from the time of Apollo where he presents a documentary about Apollo. I think it was from BBC Horizon, where you see him getting into one of these spacesuits. He really, well, he's not getting into it, he's getting out of it. He walks onto the set wearing this big spacesuit, this moon suit, and he sort of waves and he talks through the radio intercom with his helmet on, and you see him getting out of it and he has to be helped by about 2 people. These spacesuits, there's several layers to the spacesuit. There's like an internal layer where you have like circulating water, which is part of the radiator system essentially to keep you. You can see it's both heating elements and radiating elements, both cooling elements, in order to prevent the astronaut overheating or getting too cold and freezing. And these all connect to the backpack. There's an air supply, obviously, which fills the suit with air so you can breathe. It's a very complicated piece of machinery. Anything goes wrong on the moon, you've had it, you're toast. On the International Space Station, you see them getting on these. You see them getting the similar spacesuits on the International Space Station, and they need several people to help them. But there was no one. They had to help each other on here. Once one guy got suits on, who helped the other guy? So this is the background to this first EVA, the extravehicular activity on the moon. And so Marcus is discussing several things, including Armstrong took 2 photographs of Aldrin coming down the ladder, and then he turned the camera and for some reason photographed the underneath of the lunar module. Despite the fact you'd probably have to adjust the apertures and exposure time and things like that. And he went back to photographing Aldrin, which seems a bit strange. But there's a bag of something underneath the LEM which Marcus calls a rubbish bag, and this is what Steve's going to talk about.
Yeah, okay, well, for a start, I might see if I can go back and show you the clip he's talking about I mean, you can pause it yourself and look at it just previous to this. Buzz Aldrin is coming out of the lunar module backwards. He's well lit because of the lunar surface.
No, he's not. I'll explain more about that. He's not lit from the lunar surface.
If you look at the lunar surface, the lunar surface here is very bright. It's very bright. And you've got light reflecting off the lunar surface.
Actually, the albedo, that is the reflective ratio of the surface of the moon, is about 7%, which is about the same as tarmac. So it's the tarmac you get on roads, which is very dark. It doesn't reflect much light. It does look as if the moon appears bright in the sky because we can see it. It reflects 7% of the light from the sun coming back, which means when you look at the moon as a whole, it appears bright. Indeed, if you had a ball of rock the size of the moon, covered it with tarmac, it would look exactly the same. If the moon was as reflective as as it would be needed in this case, and in fact even that in itself is not an explanation. It would be too bright to look at night, and nighttime would be almost as bright as daytime if the moon was really that reflective.
And upward direction, and it's illuminating. You can actually see it illuminating. This is a crinkly surface on the spacecraft here.
Okay, he's talking about this gold foil, which was actually covering a lot of the descent stage of the lunar module, and he says that on the crinkles which point downwards, they appear to be lit. On the crinkles point upwards are in shadow. However, you can't actually tell which is which from a two-dimensional picture. You just see like a crinkly sort of tin foil covering. It's actually gold. No expense spared. You see $20 billion on that, so that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and the surfaces that are sort of under surfaces are being illuminated, and the surfaces on top are in shadow.
You can't tell which is which.
Reflecting up. It's reflecting up off the lunar surface onto the spacecraft and onto Mr. Aldrin.
Well, funnily enough, the only part of the LEM which is not illuminated in any way is the underside, the engine cowling at the bottom. You can't see anything of that. It's in total shadow. There's a couple of other structures under there which are in complete shadow. Now, if there's sunlight striking the lunar surface and coming upwards and illuminating things from below, why is the underside of the LEM not the brightest part of the structure?
And he does go on to say that, you know, there's no blast crater. Well, he's completely wrong with regard to what he's...
Oh, right. Now, this is what happened was the descent engine of the LEM is pointing downwards as the craft comes into land. And indeed, on several of the missions, including Apollo 11, you hear the astronaut saying, "We're kicking up a little bit of dust." That is the blast of the rocket engine. The rocket exhaust is actually disturbing the lunar dust on the surface. And there's a blast crater down there. Now, there's no... Now, according to Steve's now going to say, I'll let him say it.
He says about that, but I'll leave a link below to someone that's got a much better explanation. There's got a bit of map.
All right, that is where is that? Oh, he hasn't left a link below. Is it something from the Clavius website, Steve? I bet you it is, because I've been through all that. And if you want to put something, if you want to put a source as Clavius, I've debunked it all. Okay.
Math as well to actually prove his case, whereas Mr. Allen here gives an opinion. He gives
proof, evidence.
There's no mathematics. He's got no calculations there to prove what he's saying.
Well, the mathematics can be done if you want the mathematics to be done, but we're dealing with a rocket engine which is pointing downwards, which is literally just feet off the surface, and you say there's actually a blast crater there. I would say there's not, but go on.
So you can put a line through anything he has to say about blast craters and thrust.
Again, that's right. He's not a mathematician now. See, he's not only is he not an astrophysicist, now he's not a mathematician. So again, you're wrong because not a mathematician. It's like Stefan Molyneux. Wrong because dolphins. Watching Matt Molyneux has actually been very useful to this because he understands this sort of thing. Obviously, he doesn't share my views or Marcus's views on the moon landings, but he understands logical fallacies, and he's enhanced my awareness of them.
Completely clueless. But anyway, you can see there's a well-defined, I think there's very well-defined. Right, depression in the ground there.
He's talking about, like, if you look at those pictures, you can get them off NASA. I'm not going to show you them. You can get them off NASA's website. There's a depression in the ground underneath the lunar module. Okay, there's a blast crater. Now there's where are we? Here we go. Yeah, there's a depression underneath. And I just missed something. I'm just going to move some of my notes to another spot. One moment. Right, here we go. Right, that's just because I missed something out before. Okay. Now you have a blast crater underneath. He sees this depression underneath the LEM, and he says that's a blast crater. I think it's more like part of the natural contours of the lunar surface, and indeed, it's actually, I think he's wrong. I mean, there's something that this comes up later on when he talks about another photograph, which I'll come into then. But the surface of the moon is not flat; it's bumpy, and indeed, the place where Apollo 11 landed, there's a lot of contours. There's it's quite uneven, and I think this may be part of the natural unevenness of the surface. There's no sign of any vitrification or burning of the soil, which is what you would get. I've seen now I've seen a vertical takeoff and landing rocket. We all have, with most recently with the ones that Elon Musk has been launching into space with SpaceX. They actually come down and they land vertically onto the rocket pad. Now I've seen other trials done of these, and I can't say when maybe Musk has solved this problem, but when they actually land these VTOL rockets, they almost dig a hole, they almost burn a hole in the ground. You see them coming in land. There's some tests of these early VTOL rockets, and they come down and they launch up on the landing pad. They come back down. Usually they come back down on a. If they don't come back down on the landing pad, they come back down on a normal runway or something. And at the end of it all, there's this burning, smoking hole full of bright black. Whatever the surface of the pad is made of, caused by both the pressure and the heat of that engine. Now you don't see that on the moon. You don't see it. There's no sign of any burning or vitrification. There's just like a slight dip in the ground, and the surface of the ground is the same colour as everywhere else. There's no sign of any scorching. And also, as Marcus is going to point out, I think I'm getting ahead of myself here, but footprints. Yeah, Mark. I'll let Steve say all this.
The dust is being blown out as the rocket motor, as the spacecraft descended. He's calling this a rubbish bag. Now I don't know if that's a rubbish bag. Do NASA call this a rubbish bag?
Does it matter, Steve? How is it relevant? And what he's talking about here is there's this big white bag underneath the descent stage now. It's just lying on the ground as Aldrin descends. It's something that must have been dumped there by Armstrong, because he was the only other guy that came up beforehand. Now Marcus calls it a rubbish bag. If it's not, maybe it has something else in it. Maybe Steve's going to explain. I'm not going to play that bit, but I'll let him. I'll let him play it, because I'll come.
Maybe this is the bag that contains the pole for the flag, you know, in a few sections, and maybe the curled up flag in there, and there, you know, Neil Armstrong has got out, and Buzz has thrown this out. Neil's just moved it out the way so that Buzz can come down the ladder without landing on it, and they're going to go and put the flag up. How does he know this is a rubbish bag?
Who cares? Does it matter? Why does it matter?
I suspect he doesn't.
So what?
It's not my choice. We'll show you the exact sequence later. Photograph the rubbish.
That's right, this was a sequence of photograph on the same reel. It seems, as I said, it's a strange sequence. You start photographing the guy coming down the ladder, and suddenly you go, click, I want to take a photograph of something underneath the lamp. And you have to change all the settings on the cameras, take that photograph, go back to Aldrin, and change the settings again to photograph Aldrin. As the poor guy's coming down the ladder. He's on his way down the ladder. What are you doing? Fuck, come on, keep the camera on me.
Back and where's the blast crater?
Yeah.
And again, I just showed you where the blast.
There's no blast crater.
It is a 10,000-pound thrust rocket here.
There's no. You see, the dust that was kicked up. Where did it go? Because it wasn't kicked very far. Because the astronauts were able to leave footprints in it quite close to the craft. Indeed, the first footprint, I mean, when it's a very famous one actually, because when Neil Armstrong stepped off the ladder and said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," he left spores on the ground in the dust that was just directly outside the craft. So obviously that dust hadn't been kicked away, had it? It hadn't been kicked up but not kicked away.
Which has slowed the craft down from its order speed of 4,500 miles an hour.
Talking about now the rocket engine, which was running.
Faster than any aircraft that try to move it down.
The purpose of the descent stage was to slow the aircraft down from orbital speed.
Oh, I hear you saying. No, they slowed it down. It wasn't 10,000 pounds. It was about 2,000.
So they would slow it down.
And it was coming out of the nozzle of the air. It had an area of about 1,000 square inches. Just over 30 inches in diameter. Therefore, it was only about 1 pound per square inch on the lunar surface. Rubbish.
Yeah, and that's what he's talking absolute rubbish.
No, he's not. No, he's not.
The lunar module weighed about 15 tonnes. It burned about 7.5 tonnes of fuel descending down to the lunar surface. So it weighed, on Earth it would have weighed about 7.5 tonnes. On the Moon it's going to weigh a sixth of that. Remember, the gravity on the Moon is a sixth. So it would have the thrust on the motor would have been reduced to, I don't know, a bit over 1,000 pounds probably.
Well, that's still quite a lot.
So this guy's, again, talking out of his backside.
Yeah, obviously the descent engine would not have been on full throttle, okay? Because it was simply keeping the craft up until it could find the proper landing site. They were using directional thrusters to get it to the right landing site. But it was still running. Now, I've told you, I've just described to you video, you can see it, where they're testing a vertical takeoff and landing rocket. It's older than the one, it's from a few years ago. I know these have been perfected by SpaceX. But this was an experimental one, and as I explained, it comes down and it's just hovering and it comes down, exactly like the LEM was. And as I explained, it digs, it burns, it sears a hole in the ground with the heat and pressure of that rocket engine. Yes, it was 1,000 pounds of, it was maybe throttled down to 1,000 pounds of thrust, but 1,000 pounds is a lot, especially when you're burning hypergolic fuels at several thousand degrees centigrade. There's going to be more than just like a little depression, which is the same colour as everywhere else. There's no burning or scorching, no. But it's Steve, think this over. Marcus has got a point here, and besides, I think the depression you pointed out is, as I explained before, is not even a crater. It's a part of the natural contours of the lunar surface.
But he's absolutely clueless. He offers no evidence for what he's saying. He shows no math for what he's saying. This is just his opinion, and he's talking rubbish.
It's evidence.
If you're coming down in a helicopter...
Oh, he's comparing it to a helicopter now.
Would you expect the helicopter to turn its power off as it came into the ground? No.
Actually, I think you do, don't you, when you're landing in a helicopter?
It makes no
You
difference.
do actually reduce the power as you're coming into land. You have to reduce the power in order for the helicopter to drop. In the same way you have to reduce the thrust on a rocket motor if you're bringing a spacecraft into land. Yeah, this guy really is clueless. I can't believe that he gets so many people go along to pay money to see this guy speak, or to listen to this guy speak, and just look at this ridiculous presentation.
This would produce a fairly powerful...
This is just, that's really... People make the decision to see Marcus speak because we think what he's saying is true. I made the decision to ask him to speak at Dreaming Sources because I think that his points are valid. You can't... And if you don't believe why, well, explain why we're wrong. Which I know you're trying to do in this video, unsuccessfully. But I mean, I could say anything. I could say, well, 2 and 2 is not... 2 and 2 does not equal 4 because, only people who are not astrophysicists say that. So there. Or it's Codswallop that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Okay, so then you're labelling you're labelling a conclusion with a derogatory term, and that means you don't ever have to explain why it's wrong. And this is done all the time in our world, and you're doing it now. I think that's everything. Let's have a look. Don't want to miss anything. Footprints, no engine. Oh, the engine noise, right? Yeah, that's another point, which Steve doesn't bring up. But there's no visible exhaust plume from the LEM, and you see this when it takes off. I think that comes up later. Yeah, that comes up later. Yeah, I'll leave that for later. But there's no engine noise. I mean, you can hear a vague hissing in the background as when you listen to the actual landing of the craft. It doesn't make any actual noise. When you think, well, rocket engines are extraordinarily noisy. They create a lot of vibration. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen a rocket launch. I mean, I've never seen a big space rocket launch. I've seen smaller rockets launch, and they are really loud. They create a lot of vibration. The actual launching of the Saturn V, one of the main reasons people have to be a long way away is because it's actually dangerously loud on their ears. It could even damage other parts of your body, not just your ears, because of the vibration. The sound is so loud. So why is there no vibration on the LEM when it's coming into land. I mean, there's also the fact that the space shuttle has the same kind of rockets when it's in orbit and it's using manoeuvring rockets. It uses rockets at the same design as the LEM engine. These not only produce a visible exhaust plume, which I'll come on to later, but they are very, very loud. They rattle the entire craft. So that's another question that needs to be answered.
Glass, which should shift all this.
He doesn't know that. This is just his opinion.
I'm going to go forward.
No, he's got no idea.
Okay.
Lunar dust, very clearly. See this indentation? Directly below the rocket motor.
Just go back.
Anything that doesn't fit his net.
Let's have a look. Okay, so right. Okay, well, on to the next bit. 30, I misread that. 3630, not 36. 3630. There we go. Right.
Presentation.
And this would produce a fairly powerful blast, which should shift all this.
He doesn't know that. This is just his opinion. He's no, he's got no idea.
It's evidence, not opinion.
Okay, let's run on a little bit.
All this dust stuff here, you can see that it's fairly dusty, as you see footprints later. But there's no glass pressure. There's no indication that this thing was working.
Of course there is. There's a clear indentation in the ground under the.
No, there's not. I've been through that.
Under the lunar module. This guy sees what he wants to see, but he doesn't see what he doesn't want to see. Anything that doesn't fit his narrative is ignored.
Now, we should point this out because I mean, I'll come on. There's another bit later, but I'll insert it in now, where he talks about the classic photo. This is a photograph of Buzz Aldrin that was taken on the moon, and it's one of the most famous pictures of all. You just see him standing looking at the camera, and it's called the classic photo. It's the one you often get in the publicity shots and things like that. And you see the reflection in his visor. You see Neil Armstrong photographing him with a camera. Now, there's a lot of anomalies associated with that photograph, not least the angles and things like that. And this is explained away by the skeptics as the uneven terrain on which the Apollo 11 mission landed. So this uneven terrain is an explanation for why, to clear up some of the anomalies in the classic photos, yet this uneven terrain is suddenly not an explanation for why there is a depression under the lunar module's descent engine. So Steve, do you see the problem here I have with this? Do you understand what I'm talking about now?
Just which is true for most conspiracy theorists. They'll form an opinion and they'll spruik that opinion, and they never let the facts get in the way of a good story.
Absolute rubbish. Absolute rubbish.
And again, I think that's very clearly.
You can see there is a depression. There is a depression underneath the LEM. You can see it from the shadow of one of the LEM's landing legs. You can actually see it.
A depression.
But
in the lunar dust.
There's no sign of
Very
it being.
See this indentation?
Yes, there's an indentation.
Directly below the rocket motor.
Yeah, there's an indentation. It's directly below the rocket motor. That's true. But there's, as I said, there's no reason to think that this is caused by the descent engine of the LEM.
He had to photograph the planets to make sure that they weren't damaged, so quite what they were doing for the work was put on the lens. Oh, he's coming out a bit further now. Come back and take photographs.
Okay, we're back to the photographs of Aldrin descending the lunar LEM.
Okay, so he's going to say that Buzz Aldrin here has got his hands on the rails, but his feet aren't in contact with the ladder.
Now, this is I think the third or fourth photo of Buzz Aldrin coming out of the lunar module and descending the ladder. He's at the top of the ladder. He's holding onto the handrails, and his left leg is sort of stuck out at an angle. You maybe know the photo I'm talking about. It's a very interesting photo. This series is the most interesting of all the lunar photos. Now, Marcus and Steve are going to explain why they have different opinions on this.
10 feet up in the air, you know, would you do that from your garage roof? What you've got to bear in mind.
He is up in the air. He's on unknown terrain. He's just come out of the lunar module. I'll just start marking these. I'm just going to just mark the notes when I've actually done them. So I'll put an X by it because I'm just getting my notes mixed up a bit here. Okay.
Mine, of course, is 1/6 gravity.
Okay, so you're 10 feet up in the air, like you're climbing up off your garage roof. It's about 10 feet. Okay, you'd be careful if you were coming down a ladder. Yes, you would. And what Steve's point is,
coming out backwards.
Yeah, he's coming out backwards.
His hands on the rails.
You can't see where you're going,
out.
and you'd be very cautious. And the thing about it is, I know it's just 1/6 gravity, but your instincts would still be there. Your self-preservation instincts and the awareness that you're a certain height would still be there. And besides, even falling in 1/6 gravity on the moon is still dangerous. You could damage your spacesuit, which, as I've said, on the moon would be the end of you. It would be fatal. And it's very unlikely, if the spacesuit was damaged in any way, that it wouldn't have some implications. Even minor damage could make it non-functional, which would kill you.
And you would swing down and you'd put your feet on the ladder, especially if you only weighed a sixth of what you do on Earth. I don't see any problem with this at all. Someone takes a picture, or a couple of pictures while you're actually swinging out. There's going to be, you know, 1 or 2 pictures of you where only your hands are in contact. Because
he's not swinging out. You can't. He's not swinging out.
You're in that swinging motion, and it's a snapshot.
In fact, there's actually TV footage of this which covers this sequence of photographs, and at no point does Aldrin actually do that with his left leg. He doesn't actually stick it out like that.
I don't see anything wrong with that at all.
Yes.
This is one of the most ridiculous photographs I have ever seen. He's supposedly on the moon. No atmosphere. He's in his spacesuit, which is cumbersome, difficult to maneuver. You can't see where he's put his feet.
Well,
okay, I'll come on to this in a moment. Now, what Marcus has said is that when you're wearing one of these big spacesuits, you can't actually see where you're putting your feet. Now, but I'll come on to that in a moment. First of all, I should point out that there are other weird elements of this particular photograph, and one of those is that there's a mark, there's a bright white mark on the right boot of Buzz Aldrin in that photograph, which appears to be a bright flash of light. It's like a hotspot. It's caused by a specific beam of light hitting that boot and reflecting off at a certain angle. It's called a hotspot. Now, Dr. David Groves, who's an animation scientist and a visual scientist who runs a company in London, has analysed it and worked out not only that there is actually a light source which is basically behind the camera, which is in the shadow. I mean, all this is in the shadow of the lunar module. The sun is on the other side, but there's another light in the shadow side of the lunar module, like a flash bulb, and it is exactly, I think it's 2 point something feet to the left hand side of the photographer, which allegedly is Neil Armstrong. Now, that shouldn't be possible because there were no flash bulbs. The Apollo astronauts did not take any flash bulbs with them to the moon. They did everything in sunlight. They relied on sunlight for all these photographs. I should point out that this reflected light, because what Steve's going to suggest, and he's going to go into more detail in a minute, is that all these visual anomalies you see are caused by reflected light from the lunar surface. And I've already explained how that doesn't make sense in one way, but if you actually look at that same photograph, it's a very important photograph, you'll see there's actually a shadow cast from the actual overhang of the door of the porch. It's called the porch. This overhang shielding the hatchway, and you can actually see a line of shadow on the hatchway door, a line of shadow, which indicates the sun is coming in from a certain angle. It's leaving a line on the hatchway. Well, not the sun. A light is coming in and leaving a line. So you're not getting some kind of just some general specular glow from the lunar surface. You have a very specific light source which is local to the scene, which I think it disproves, that in itself disproves the surface reflection hypothesis, which I'll go into in a minute, and I think I've covered everything there. Okay, it's going to carry on because there's going to be more about this in a moment. We'll go forward slightly.
He doesn't know that. He can't possibly know that.
Okay. So
Touching the ladder.
So what? So what? He's in motion when the doesn't know that.
Steve doesn't say, well, Marcus can't possibly know that when you're wearing one of these Apollo suits, you can't see where you're putting your feet when you're on a ladder, because Marcus has never put one on. Well, you don't. You have to put one on. You look at these spacesuits. Look how bulky they are. Look at the huge helmet that goes over people's heads with the visor, which is tinted. It's tinted to protect your eyes from the very bright sunlight, which is not filtered by the atmosphere. It should be extremely bright. It's not only that, but the fact it's not filtered by the atmosphere means it has ultraviolet in it as well, which could cause cataracts and things like that, which could blind you. So they keep their visors down nearly all the time when they're on the moon. There's only one shot where you see them without their visors up, and that's when they're in the shade. There's like this thing which you have to put your head through, and there's like a neck ring which is sealed, which has like a special attachment where you put the helmet on, and you look down. You can't actually see. You can't see anything of your chest. You can't see anything really below that sort of level. So you can't see where you're putting your feet, and you can't feel very well either because you're wearing these huge boots, which have these very, very thick boots with these massive soles, with these special prehensile soles. So I think this is what Marcus is saying is absolutely true. And Steve, I think you can. I think Marcus can make a judgment on this.
That's his opinion.
See inside the spacesuit.
How does he know what you can see from the inside of a spacesuit?
I've just explained why.
Of course he doesn't.
His right foot is not touching the ladder.
So what?
I'm going to go forward a bit.
So what? Apologies.
4105. Go back a bit. I believe I'm assessing what Steve says here fairly. Right, here we go.
Where he lives, I think. Okay, now this is another picture that he spoke about earlier on, and I don't think I commented.
Right, this is the next photo in the sequence, which is Buzz Aldrin climbing down the ladder, and he's almost at the bottom. Okay, he's almost at the bottom there.
On this, but if I did, apologies. But you know, I'm doing these clips at different times on different days.
I know the feeling. I'm doing the same sort of thing.
I'm not going to sit down and spend some considerable time editing all this together seamlessly. So if I've said this before, I do apologise. Now he's saying that there's another light source for this photograph because this is the shadow of the lunar module. This is Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder.
Check out the picture. You know what I mean. Basically, Aldrin's coming down the ladder. He's in the shadow. There's the sun behind, with the landscape lit up very nicely. It's not overexposed. It's completely. You can see features of it, and he's coming down the ladder and on the shadow side, and you can see you can see all the detail, which is apparently light reflected from the lunar surface, and I don't think that's true.
He's in the shadow of the lunar module, yet he's extremely well lit. And he says that there's another light source. If you look at the shadow on the top of the backpack, I think it shows fairly obviously that he's illuminated by light reflecting off the lunar surface.
No,
look how bright the lunar surface is.
No, it just shows the light source is below the level of the backpack. That's all it shows. And I believe the light source. I think I can judge quite clearly exactly where the level of the secondary light source is.
The light's coming off the lunar surface and it's reflecting upwards.
No, it's not, because you can see in that very picture that the darkest part of that entire photo is the underside of the lunar module. You can't hardly see the engine cowling. There's another structure there. It's like I think a support for one of the legs sticking out. It's in complete blackness. That's the underside of the LEM, right? Which is very, very close to the ground. It's probably the closest spot to where this alleged reflected light from the sun is bouncing back up on the far side of the LEM, but you can hardly see it. This means, I think, that the actual secondary light source is not only to the it's to the left, and I mean, you'll see in a moment that which explains something. Hang on.
Shadow from the lunar module coming out here somewhere, but all around there, and it's going to be super bright, just like this lunar surface here. Remember, it's not flat, it's not smooth, it's all bumpy and jagged.
Yeah, but you can see all the flatness and smoothness and bumps. Now, Jarrah White, the Australian researcher into this, has done an experiment with this to actually test it by using different exposure settings for cameras. And he said the only way to actually reproduce this effect in which you do on the Earth on a sunlit day, which is, I think, is an important point, because a lot of the debunkers, like the Jay Windley thing, which was a documentary, or Did We Go to the Moon, or something like that, and the BBC did one, and also Mythbusters, they actually reproduced. They said the moon landings can't possibly be shot in a studio. Because we proved it, because they recreate the moon landing settings in a studio with artificial lights. Jarrah White does it the right way. He does it on a sunny day on Earth with no additional light sources. And what he's indicated is you can't reproduce this effect using just sunlight. He showed that the only way you can actually get the exposure settings on the camera to get a detailed image of the shadow side of the lunar module is to leave the aperture so wide and the exposure time so long that everything on the sunny side of the picture is completely whited out. You just get this big white glow, this blob. But you can see clearly on the NASA image from the moon, allegedly, you don't get that. You get both the shadow side and the sunlit side appear to be equally visible, which is only possible in photography if you have a secondary light source. Otherwise, what you get is you would get you would either have like a huge silhouette. You'd have like you set the exposure settings to capture the sunlit side, then the side of the shadow side would be just a silhouette. It would just be a big blob of black. And conversely, as Jarrah White showed, if you set your exposure to capture the light in the shadow side, the sunlit side would be a big blob of white. You can either have it one way or the other. You can't have it both ways. A camera is not like the human. It's not like the eye. It's different in that sense. Oh, right.
The light's going to be reflecting off in all directions, and it's reflecting off the ground up at
it's not
Mr. Aldrin.
I reckon, I estimate that the secondary light source is not only to the left of the photographer, but it's about shoulder height. I mean, it's about shoulder height in order to create that shadow effect on the back of the backpack, which Steve mentioned, but also be too high to illuminate the underside of the lem. And also, you see there's other things like the hotspot I talked about, which Dr. David Groves talked about.
You can see it's crinkly stuff on the spacecraft, as I've mentioned before.
No.
And the undersides of the crinkles are illuminated, and the top.
You don't know which are the undersides and which ones are not.
From the lunar
as I explained.
surface. So I don't see anything wrong with this picture at all. Again, the light
There's a lot wrong
from
with
the lunar surface is illuminating the inside of here.
Yeah, it's illuminating the inside of the porch, and you can see quite clearly there's a shadow line on the inside of the. Like you can actually see the light is not just a specular reflection of the general environment. It is a specific spotlight which produces a shadow line like this. You see, you get like a shadow line on my face. You see, from my finger held up to the light. See, that's the effect you have here.
Showing the hatch. If there was a studio lighting, another light source, as Mr. Allen is suggesting, I think you would get some strange shadowing. You know, if there was some light coming in, maybe from here or to the right of the camera.
From the right, no, but not if it was to the left. You see, if it's done properly, you do not get the additional the shadow effects. If it's done properly, if you have a soft light to the left, you know, maybe another one higher up, you can actually get the effect we're talking about here. Marcus has talked about this in some of his other talks, as has other researchers such as Mary Bennett and David Percy in their particular video, which is called what's it called? Did We Go to the Moon? And there's a book called Dark Moon, Apollo and the Whistleblowers, which I very much recommend.
Camera, did he say? I think he said. He said there was some a light source at the right of the camera.
No, left.
I think he was referring to that image.
No, it's left.
There'd be a shadow of that leg on that leg.
No, not if it's to the left. And you wouldn't see a shadow of the left leg because
there's no shadows here on the ladder.
You're seeing.
So
You're seeing Buzz Aldrin from the right. He's coming in from basically his right quarter.
The only shadow is on the top of his backpack, which is exactly where you'd expect.
Okay, so now, funny enough, that's enough of that bit, I think. Nvidia, do you know the computer and graphics card producer? Nvidia, they created a crop circle once, a novelty crop circle, which is quite funny. They did a whole video where they claimed to prove the moon landings were real, and Marcus and I got on top of this pretty quickly when this came out. And well, it was Marcus primarily who did the work. I reported on it and put my own sixpence in, but it was Marcus who did the work, and he proved that Nvidia were lying. They claimed to have taken that particular image and proved that therefore the moon landings had to be real because they analysed it. They lied. They lied about the various light inputs. They fiddled. They massaged the figures to make it look wrong. And I mean, Jarrah White actually made a video about this, and Marcus did. It was very dishonest indeed. Okay, I'm going to go forward a little bit. We've covered everything in that bit. Steve's going to ramble on for a little while, like he does. He tends to repeat himself a lot, Steve. So we'll go forward to 44. Where is it? 44 minutes. God, this is long. It's an hour and 25 minutes. It's going to be a long bloody video.
A dimension.
Taken showing Earth.
So there.
Now we're going to talk about a photograph that was taken on one of the Apollo missions, where you see the Earth above the lunar module. You see the lunar module in the foreground, and above it you see the Earth up in the sky. Now, before you can go to your calculations and you can check whether the Earth would have been in that position based on where the missions landed, because the missions did tend to land close to the centre of the Earth-facing side, the near side, the Earth side of the Moon, as opposed to the dark side, which faces away. But however, it should be possible to calculate whether the Moon should have been in that exact position. But that's beside the point. The point is that how did they get that photograph using the particular cameras? Now the cameras they use, they're especially modified cameras made by Hasselblad, a Swedish optics firm, and they're very interesting because they're specially designed to be handled by the gloves or the spacesuit. Although there's some debate over whether even with the special modifications they can actually be handled by these big armoured gloves. But the point is that there's no viewfinder. And there's no way, the photographs are mostly taken with the camera attached to a chest bracket, and the only way to actually train the camera is to rotate and alter the angle of the body when you're with these spacesuits on. So how did they get that photo? Did they lean back?
How did they take that photo? Think about it. The Earth.
Go forward a bit.
To get the Earth in. How did he get the Earth in? He's going to say, well, that's how you would get the Earth in. Maybe it was a different camera. Maybe it was a camera other than...
No, they only had the Hasselblad, specially modified Hasselblad cameras with them. They didn't have any flash bulbs. They just had the specially modified Hasselblads with no viewfinder.
Camera used that they used that was clipped to the spacesuits. I don't think it's... I think this is just... This is not a point at all. It's pointless. Look at these two images. How did they manage to take that picture? I don't think that'd be difficult at all.
Well, it would be.
As I said, you can see the strut there. Could very easily. This bloody Norton thing. This could very easily have been taken by taking a camera off the suit, just pointing up in the sky and taking the pictures.
Yeah, you could take
using a different camera. Remember, there's only 1/6 gravity on the Moon.
Got to do with it?
Maybe one of them did lean back, and the other one stood behind him to support him while he took the picture. Took the pictures. You know, I mean, if that was you, how would you take them? I don't think that would be particularly challenging, to be perfectly honest.
Okay. Now, the thing about it is, there's another picture which is quite similar, which I think was taken Apollo 14, where they do indeed detach the camera from the chest bracket and hold it in their hands to take the photograph. Yet, and they get a very, very accurate image of an astronaut and a flag and the Earth in the background. It's a very, very effective image. It's quite a famous lunar image. And the question is though, there's only one. They don't like bracket it by moving it around and taking a couple of shots. They just take a single shot. You're talking about a camera without a viewfinder. Now, at some point in that video, I didn't actually play the bit. Steve says, well, it doesn't matter because it's a wide-angle lens. But is it wide enough angles to know you actually have the object in frame correctly when there's no viewfinder and you're holding it like that? And you can't. It's very this cumbersome suit with this visor. There's several scenes where they have trouble lining up their TV camera, and Mission Control has to keep telling them to move the TV camera to the left or to the right. Which shows that they, if you can't actually see through the camera lens viewfinder what you're actually photographing, it's very, very difficult to know you have it framed. I mean, I can't. This camera is very, very difficult to use unless I'm basically, kind of really close to me doing a selfie shot. Unless I am using the viewfinder, either the monitor here or the actual lens viewfinder, this is my old camera. The new one doesn't have one. So I think, Marcus, there's reason there to think Steve, I think Marcus is right there. Right, we're going to go forward to 47 minutes now, getting through this. Okay.
Heroes.
Right.
Top one, Buzz Aldrin, bottom one, Neil Armstrong. And
these are photographs that were taken of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. They're smiling, posing for the camera, supposedly in the lunar module, just after they've been walking on the moon. This is alleged now.
I put it in that format because this was
The moon. Yeah. Before they even reached the moon. Okay.
Well, according to Marcus, yeah, these photographs were taken under controlled conditions in a studio setting before they actually left Earth, or before they actually got to the moon. I mean, why not? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. You can do that, but they're pretending they're not. Now, what's interesting about these photographs, I won't dwell on these too much because it's a rather shallow point. But you can see these images. You can see these images of the two men smiling for the camera, and they have like little flecks of light in their eyes. And Marcus says that's to do with being and on the teeth. You can see it reflected off the teeth. And Marcus says this is to do with it being a flashbulb.
So this is. I'll put a link to this source video. There we go, and that's 52:33. Ben's video, Dreaming Sources, Marcus Allen.
That's right.
So they did go to the moon after all, Mr. Allen. Well, what a surprise.
Did you find the original?
Steve's laughing a lot here. What he actually says is, he says that well, that was actually taken on the moon, and what you're looking at simply, and because it's a small compartment inside the LEM. Again, how did they get the spacesuits on? There's a lot of light. There's artificial lighting in there, which is what you're actually seeing. So there's ambient light, and that's what's caused these little blobs on the eye. These very, very sharp little blobs, and very, 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 very localized reflective spots on the eyes and teeth of the astronauts. Well, this is why I said earlier on you should look at me and look at the reflections of me when I'm smiling like this. Because if you look at me, I've got light coming from there's two artificial lights behind me, and a window in front of me, which is actually darker now because it's now almost 4 PM. When I started this, it was about 1 PM. But if you look, you can actually see my eyes and teeth are not smiling. There's not like little specks in my eyes. You can see a large amount of reflective light all over my cornea, my cornea, and my teeth. Although my teeth aren't shining white as these good old American guys, but the point is, if there was a large amount of ambient light, that's the effect you would get. What Marcus, who was a trained photographer, is saying that indicates the use of a flash bulb. The tiny small specks of light reflected indicates the use of a flash bulb. So you can see the difference, because if I used a flash bulb now, you might get the same thing. I'm not going to find the bit where Steve says that. I think I've quoted him correctly. Where are we? So he brings this up again later on, which is when, I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to carry on to the next one, because actually I need to take a little break. I'll be back in a sec. Okay, I'm back. I'm actually breaking one of my rules now. I'm a bit tired. I had a bit of a difficult morning at work. I got double booked at one point. It was a bit annoying. I had a glass of wine. I don't normally booze it up while I'm making videos, but I'm going to today. Oh, I don't care. Okay, so right, let's carry on.
Oh dear, he knows very well they went to the moon. He's only...
You see, this is about 4 or 5 times you accuse Marcus of lying, and you've got no evidence for that. You don't agree with him, and so you're trying to discredit him as an individual. You know, you're just trying to, which is really, I think that's underhand. I mean, you're a skeptic I quite like, because Steve, because you disagree, but you're polite and you're rational most of the time. But this video is an exception. I think it's not up to your usual standard in terms of intellectual honesty and professionalism. So let's just carry on. We're on now 48:30. Right, shadow angles. That's right. Here we go.
Spruiking all this bloody rubbish to keep himself on the presentation circuit and to sell those ridiculous magazines. Okay, on with the next clip.
That's why I need a bloody drink. This is just I need to calm my nerves listening to all this.
So these are the two astronauts, Aldrin and Armstrong. Are the shadow lengths different?
Shadow, yeah. This is he's showing a photograph from the LEM camera, the LEM TV camera, where you were looking down on the astronauts, and you can see that the shadow. There's many anomalies on the lunar surface regarding shadow angles and shadow directions and length, which indicates that this wasn't just shot in sunlight. There was a local source of light, which indicates possibly a large floodlight like you get at sports arenas, which is much closer. So this was done maybe outdoors at night, and you have like a floodlight where you get different effects than you would in sunlight. And there's many reasons for thinking this. It's a big subject. David Percy, Mary Bennett have done a huge analysis work, a massive amount of analysis work on this. Steve really does. Steve is going to mention this, and this is why I'm mentioning it, but he doesn't go into detail about it. I'll just let him carry on.
Are the angles different?
Okay, let's have a look at this bit.
I don't know what these are. They're not lens correct. So, anomalies, unexplained details. Here is the famous man on the moon photograph.
Yeah, right. just out of curiosity there, or just.
Steve's now showing a picture of the classic photo.
I mean, obviously this guy's legs are not different lengths, are they? Yeah, the shadows are different lengths.
The shadows of Aldrin, or whoever's playing Aldrin, on the classic photo, are very clearly different. They are distorted by the direction of the light source, of course, but also the hump in the ground. There's a distinct hillock between where Aldrin is standing and where the camera is standing. He's standing probably about 20 feet away from the camera, which is reflected in his visor apparently, unless that's a big subject. But you can see there's a distinct hillock in the ground. There's a hump, and that's what causes it. But not all the shadow anomalies that David and Mary have pointed out, which Marcus has mentioned, which Steve hardly touches on, can be explained like that.
You know, this leg is not a foot longer than this one, is it? So his shadow argument, this picture here proves that his shadow argument is bloody rubbish.
No, it doesn't.
Just this picture.
It doesn't, though.
Okay, well that's not why I actually started that. It's very difficult to line these things up precisely unless you put a lot of time and effort into it, and you know me, I don't do that. So let's just move on.
Same with bottom one here, Neil Armstrong. Inside the little module as it rested on the moon's surface. Now, what do you see in here?
He's gone back to the pictures of the astronauts and what they were taking.
Okay, so what he's going to say here is that the light shining in the eyes.
This is just a repeat of what
is indicative of the picture being taken with a flash.
No, this is just a repeat of what he said earlier. So I'll move on from that. Okay. Right, so 54, 41. How can we go forward? Okay, so is he just repeating what he said before? Okay.
Okay, so that's one of the landing pads on the lunar module. And after this, he says, "Well, no one's ever told us that you know, lunar dust won't stick to anything that's made on Earth."
There's a photograph showing that the landing pad, which is covered in gold foil and is attached to the landing leg, of course, resting on the lunar surface, and it's completely clean. It's pristine, to use Marcus's language. It's not a speck on it, like the pristine bullet. Yeah, which is odd because, according to Armstrong, it should have at least a handful of dust fragments on top of it.
It's probably because it's not true. It's probably because lunar dust will stick to stuff that's made on Earth, but it won't. What he's getting at is, why isn't there any dust in this pad?
It's like a bowl shape. It's like a rim around the outside, which is higher, and it dips in the middle to where there's this attachment to the leg strut, which attaches it to which supports the lem.
One of the landing pads, yeah. And the reason for that is, now, if obviously he has as I've shown in this video already, he knows the Americans went to the moon. I'm going to leave a clip at the end, actually, just with the three clips together, I think, of him saying about the Americans going to the moon. His little Freudian slips. But whether he knows or not, I don't know. If he did know, he wouldn't tell you. I think the Gemini, you know, the bit he did with the Gemini.
Gets the point.
That the ladder was on. It could be sticking up and it could puncture a spacesuit, or it could get in the way. So,
all right. Now, what he's talking about now is what, like, on 3 of the LEM landing pads, not the one with the ladder, is there's these wires, these stiff wires hanging down called prongs, and they're called contact prongs. They haven't got them on the side where the ladder is, because they might get sort of bend upwards and cause loops and things that could puncture a spacesuit or could cause the astronaut to trip over. So they haven't got one on that. All the other 3s have these things sticking down, and what happens is these prongs detect contact with the ground. Now, as soon as they detect contact with the ground, the rocket motor automatically cuts off. So this is 1.8 meters below the landing pad. You have these prongs. So basically, the moment the LEM is 1.8 meters off the ground, its landing pads, the engines are automatically cut off by these contact prongs detecting the presence of the ground, and the LEM just falls the rest of the way. So that's what Steve is saying. I'll let him carry on.
3 of these prongs on 3 of these pads. Now, what these prongs do is they will illuminate a light in the lunar module. It's a contact light, and then the rocket motor, the descent motor, shuts off. So the lunar module comes down, it's reducing in thrust, it's burning off a lot of mass because it's burning about half its mass in fuel while the thing's descending. It's not running very much thrust at all by the time it gets fairly close to the surface. It does enough to blow up a bit of dust.
Steve he's just put a comment. I've got like a pop-up. I've got these pop-up things. Steve has just put a comment on one of his videos saying, "Finally seeing the light, Ben." Oh, he does like this Peasmore satire. Maybe I'll discuss that another day. So I've got distracted there. Yeah.
Dust, 1,000 odd pounds of thrust is coming out of here to lower it gently onto the surface, and the prongs touch the surface, and as soon as they touch the surface, contact light comes on, shuts the motor off, and the vehicle drops the last 1.8 meters without the rocket motor running. So the rocket motor stops. There's no air on the moon, remember, to hold the dust in suspension.
So
the rocket motor stops, and the vehicle drops the last 1.8 meters to the surface and squashes these prongs. And if you think about it, the first words actually said on the surface of the moon were contact light. because as soon as the prongs touch the surface, the vehicle is touching the surface, they are effectively on the surface of the moon. And that was, if you listen to the recording of the Eagle landing on the moon, you'll hear, I can't remember which one it was now, but one of them says contact light, and that told them that the vehicle, the prongs hanging down from these pads, had actually touched the surface. And the rocket motor shuts off and the vehicle just drops the last 1.8 metres. So the dust is not being blown up all over the place.
Isn't it? So the dust is not being blown up all over the place. So when you say there's no air to hold it in suspension, which is true, yet it is being blown up. You know, it's commented on by the Armstrong. You can actually see it flying up into the air, and you're saying that none of it could possibly, even though there's this directional rocket thrust pointing downwards, and all of it conveniently spread out without rising more than 1.8 meters in the air to land on the pads, to hit, or even higher up, to hit the actual struts of the legs, and then fall down onto the pad to be captured in this bowl-like shape. Are you saying that would definitely not have happened? And the answer to that is, well, of course it didn't happen, because look, there's no dust in the lander. That's not a good enough answer. That's not a good enough answer at all. It just seems it's weird to see not a speck of dust anywhere, not just even one, anywhere. And there's several photographs like this where you can see how clean the lunar module is. It's extremely clean. Even though, as you can see from some of the movements of the astronauts, where they kick their feet, they kick the dust up, and also the lunar rover, which I'll come on to in later, you can see quite clearly that the actual dust is very, very fine. It's fine. It's like it's almost like talc in some ways. Depends on the shot, because what's odd is the dust actually varies in consistency on different shots, which is another suspicious element, but that's another point.
For that last 1.8 metres, and because there's no air on the moon, the dust is not held in suspension. There's absolutely no mystery at all as to why there is.
Right.
Mr. Allen is going to show us a picture of Everest.
Mount Everest, tallest mountain in the world.
And he will say that the picture showing the Everest base camp with Everest in the background has a similar distance and size relation to this picture here.
Right, the picture Steve is showing is what's known as the pack shot from Apollo 17. You see the lunar module, you see the rover, you see an astronaut saluting, which is itself a very, very well constructed image. And behind it is the south massif of Taurus-Littrow Valley, which is where Apollo 17 allegedly landed. And you can see from the angles here that the actual peak of the massif is only just above the top of the LEM in terms of the angle. So it's an elevation sort of like that, and I shouldn't do that, should I? Because Michael Shrimpton will go crazy. But basically it's an elevation, I'd say, or an elevation from where the camera lens is. It's difficult to tell with these camera lenses, of roughly 25 to 30 degrees. So that's the picture he's talking about. I'll let him carry on, because he's going to talk about Mount Everest in a moment.
And ask yourself, does it look the same or similar? And it doesn't. What he's saying is that the lunar module is where the Everest base camp would be, and this over here would be Everest in the background.
Marcus is saying that the distance between the peak of the mountain and indeed the location of the photographer is the same as the distance from the Mount Everest base camp, where the climbers start off, and the peak of Mount Everest, the actual summit of the mountain. Now there's a photograph here of Mount Everest, and you can see, which I'm looking at now, which I think is the one that there's several actually we can see, which shows the actual Everest base camp and the mountain itself, which is actually difficult to. It's a bit difficult to actually to make a judgment. With photographs, it's difficult to make this judgment. But I'm looking at the peak of Mount Everest, which is about the same. So it's the same, according to Marcus, it's the same vertical distance along the vertical axis and indeed the angle axis, the vertical axis and the angle axis. So the elevation should be the same. Now I'm looking at this, And from where I'm sitting now, the elevation on this particular photo of Mount Everest, and just Google it, you'll be able to see it. I'm not going to show you. Is roughly much more, I'd say 35 to 40%, rather than the 25 to 30 you see on the Apollo missions. It's not exact, but this is the point that Marcus is making. And Steve's going to, but according to Marcus, the angle should be the same. Let Steve carry on.
It's about 2 miles high, about 2 miles higher than this position, and it's about 7 miles away in the distance. And he tells us that the Everest Base Camp, Everest is about 2 miles higher, and it's about 7 miles away, just the same as this is, 7 miles away from the lunar module.
So Marcus's point is that the South Massif at Taurus-Latro Valley, when looking at the peak, it should be the same elevation as you see from the Everest Base Camp photo.
And I'll show you that clip. That clip will follow this one, and I'll then show you on Google Earth that the distance between the Everest Base Camp and the Everest summit is actually only 4.4 something miles, might be 4.47 miles.
Right, okay, this is interesting, this is an important point.
Let's
check it out.
We also don't know that this is 2 miles high.
Oh, that's good.
No effect if it...
okay, right, we'll go forward
Mount
to...
Everest...
this is where... this is where Steve actually does a Google image search of the distance between Everest Base Camp and the summit of Mount Everest, and it is indeed 4.8 miles, not 7 miles. So it's a shorter distance. Now, whether that explains the very, very large difference in elevation, I don't know. I can't work it out. But this, if this is correct, then of course Marcus has made a mistake in terms of the distance between the Everest Base Camp, the actual horizontal distance between Everest Base Camp and the summit of Mount Everest. So you draw a line from Everest Base Camp completely on the horizon to the spot underground underneath the summit of Everest. But I mean, if you by looking at these particular images, the Everest Base Camp, and indeed the Taurus-Latro Valley, does the difference, the mistake that Marcus made in terms of horizontal distance, actually account for the differences within the photographs, the two photographs? Because if it doesn't, then Marcus is still correct. I don't know precisely the answer to that. I really, really don't. So we're going to move forward. No, there's a very, very long scene here where Steve rambles an awful lot and he just repeats the same points over and over again. So I'm going to cut through that. I'm going to cut to the next point of interest, which is 10506. There we go.
The module is jumping around all over the place.
Right, this is the jumping lunar module. It's also from Apollo 17, where you see multiple photographs. Let's Steve explain.
And that these here are identical in both of these pictures.
That is the background. The background to the image includes various mountains and hills, and that in the images from Apollo 17, this backdrop appears not to change, even though the photographs are taken from great distances away from each other. And indeed, in some of the photographs you can actually see the distance is involved, because there's one photograph where it's taken with the lunar module very close, and there's one which is clearly taken miles away because they've travelled in the lunar rover across the surface, and the lunar module is so small in a distance you can hardly see it. It's just a little speck. So they've obviously travelled a number of miles away from the landing site, yet the backdrop is still the same. Now this is kind of this is an adaptation on what was said before, because if, according to Steve, very little change can be expected by 4.8 miles and the difference between 4.8 miles and 7 miles, what about the differences between the number of miles which the astronauts drove across the moon? Because the actual lunar rover has a range of, where is it? I've got the picture here. One moment. I've got it somewhere on this page. It's a number of miles anyway. Here we go. 12 miles. Oh, the longest single traverse, 12 miles 50, 4 hours 16 minutes. Maximum range from 11, 4.7 miles. That's an additional 4.7 miles. I think they said it was 23 miles. The actual range of the LEM was 20. I've got the Lunar rover. It's called the Lunar Excursion Rover. Lunar roving vehicle, Lunar moon buggy, Lunar Excursion Rover. It's several different names. And it has a range of, I think, 23 miles. And the greatest distance it went was 12.5 miles. And the maximum range from LEM, 4.7 miles, which is on Apollo 17. This is the one we're talking about here. So we're talking about an additional 4.7 miles away from that backdrop, Steve. How come that doesn't change the aspect, the parallax on that image to the same extent as the difference between the Everest Base Camp and the pack shot? It's a very important question you have to answer. And because it doesn't, it appears not to.
Yeah, the lunar module is way over there. And the lunar module is jumping around all over the lunar surface.
You have to explain these anomalies.
No, I don't think so. I mean, if you look at that, and I'll leave, as I said, the link to the video below. And this is 106.06. They are not quite identical.
There is a slight difference, I must admit.
The angles are slightly different.
Yeah, you can see in the two angles where there's probably a mile's difference. You can see the tiny change. You can see a change in the angle of the top of the massive. There is true, but it is. This doesn't explain. I mean, it's possible we're looking at three-dimensional backdrops here, perhaps made papier-mâché models rather than just simple cardboard cutout background screens. So they're not two-dimensional, actually three-dimensional backdrops that they created here. Yet this doesn't explain. There's this photograph of what they call the Tracy Rock, which is this huge boulder about the size of a house. And this is where you see the LEM, a tiny little speck in the distance. It's obviously, this may well be where they travelled the 4.7 miles. Yet you see very little change indeed, if any, in that backdrop, which I think is very, very important. And here, I'll just find, let me just see if I can see it. Here we go. Yeah, here we go. Again, it's like you see the same patterns here, which I think doesn't make sense.
And I think if you imagine that angle there, you're standing behind the lunar module and you're looking that way, these structures are quite large. You then move yourself to there and look across there, you're going to see pretty much the same thing.
I think
that is slightly different. Okay. If you look at that, so I don't think there's an anomaly there at all. And the other thing you've got to consider is these people are NASA, they're quite smart people. If they looked at those pictures and thought, oh my god, what idiot, took the fake LEM from there and put it over there, these pictures would never see the light of day.
Well, this brings us on to the prospect of the whistleblowers, which is what David Percy talks about, the possibility that some of the mistakes in the Apollo images were actually inserted deliberately. And this is why the book is called Apollo and the Whistleblowers, the subtitle Dark Moon, the Apollo and the Whistleblowers by David Percy, Mary Bennett. That some of these images were actually doctored or were imperfect. They had these mistakes put in order that maybe when the furore had, maybe in the distant future when the furore had died down and people have got over the emotion, people would go over these photographs analytically and they would spot these very subtle and almost subliminal errors. And according to David Percy, this is deliberate. This was done deliberately by people involved in the project. He believes he has evidence for that. This is what the phrase whistleblowers comes from. I don't know specifically if that's the possibility. I mean, it's possible these were just things that he never even thought of. And one of the reasons, incidentally, why I don't believe that Stanley Kubrick could possibly have been involved in this scam is because if he'd done these lunar images and these lunar footage, he'd have done a better job. There'd have been fewer errors. his perfectionism and his nitpicking and his meticulous nature would have ironed out all these little wrinkles. So that's basically, there's another little bit that Steve goes on about, but he doesn't. It's called the missing lem thing, which is just a continuation of the same point. I think I'll skip that. I'll just have a look. Hang on, here we go. Yeah, this is one thing Marcus talks about, where you'll see quite clearly there are two shots with the same backdrop, or very similar angle, taken at a very similar angle, probably within just maybe less than 100 yards of each other, with the same backdrop. Yet you can't see the lem, or the lem is miles away in the distance, the 4.8 miles or whatever it is in the distance. So that again is something. That's an explanation that you need to give me, Steve. Right. So I'll leave that. So we'll go forward now. We're going to go on to the Lunar rover. That's 1:11:14. This is a vehicle. This was an electric vehicle, wheeled vehicle, ground vehicle, which the astronauts on some of the missions used. On 3 of the missions actually, Apollo 15, 16 and 17, that they used to travel around a long way from the actual site of the landing. So it was stored on board the craft, and you just pulled it out, and it was this little electric car. Open-topped electric car, which had a little antenna, so you could transmit signals to Earth and things like that. We'll see what he has to say about that.
He's saying footprints but no wheel tracks. How did the lunar vehicle get there?
That's right. There's a photograph of the lunar roving vehicle, which is standing in the middle of this plain of dust, and there's footprints all around it, which indicates there is dust there, but there's no wheel tracks. So how did they get it there?
Remember, there is 1/6 gravity on the moon, so this probably doesn't weigh very much. And it says
it weighs, on the moon, it weighs 77 pounds in 1/6 Earth's gravity. 77 pounds. That's the equivalent of a big canister of water with 35 litres in it. Right? Yeah, you could pick it up, but this is a large, bulky item. It's a very large, bulky item, which would be... Imagine if the canister was like a big flat thing like that. That'd be much more difficult to pick up.
There's footprints, but no wheel tracks, because the guys probably just carried it there. They probably just taken it out of the lunar module, unfolded it all, and carried it over there.
Why would they bother? Why would they do that?
Ready to go, driving off.
Why would they carry it away from the lunar module? Why not drive it away from the lunar module? Why carry something that weighs 77 pounds? Even between 2 people, you're in a big spacesuit. It's a big, bulky thing, very wide, like a vehicle, like a beach buggy. It looks a bit like. You pick it up and carry it along. There's no sign of the lunar module in this shot. There's no shadows from it. There's no shade. It's just they picked it up and carried it along. I mean, why? Why'd you bother?
Somewhere. And I might even look up the weight of the lunar vehicle, so I could tell you what it would actually weigh on the moon. But it's not going to weigh very much. 2 guys.
77 pounds is still quite heavy. It's just not incredibly. It's not incredibly light.
I would think you'd be able to lift that without any bother at all. Okay, no mystery there. Next.
Oh right, now the wheel tracks. I think there is a mystery. It's still an issue. It's possible they carried it, but I think why? Now we're going to talk about this is where Marcus brings up the lunar tracks.
This is a track from the lunar vehicle.
You'd expect something weighing on Earth 450 pounds, on the moon about 60 about 70 pounds.
Oh, there you go. So he just told us that on the moon the vehicle weighs 70 pounds. So 2 guys could
77 pounds.
Easily lift that. Yeah, no mystery there.
You expect it to be...
And again, NASA are very bright people. You think if they were going to publish pictures of the vehicle on the moon, they would include tracks.
Well, not if, you know, as David Percy says, you don't have a dog and bark as well. You employ these photographic experts and you assume that they're going to verify things for you. But if these photographic experts decided to conspire against their employer and actually put in these coded messages, they wouldn't. I mean, that's a possibility. What Percy says is a possibility. It's not certain. It may just be incompetence. But I think it's a possibility. Marcus is concerned because some of the wheel tracks on the rovers look different. Even though the rover had a specifically designed wheel, there's a photograph of it here. It was a mesh with chevron-shaped treads. So it was like it's very similar to some tyres on cars on Earth. It was a meshed wheel with chevron-shaped treads.
If it was faked.
But what Marcus has shown, he's shown a series of tracks with like simply straight tread marks rather than chevron-shaped tread marks. So did some of the? I mean, there's no. The design I don't think was altered on the 3 rovers that were sent to the moon. They had the chevron-shaped treads. They didn't mix. I mean, it's actually you actually put different tyres of different tread marks on the same vehicle. It's actually very dangerous, and there used to be TV adverts warning people not to do it. You know, always have the same tread marks on your tyres on all 4 wheels. So they would have done that. They wouldn't have had separate tread patterns on different wheels on the same vehicle.
Tracks. There are footprints there. But there are no tracks in front of it or behind it. Anomaly.
No anomaly whatsoever.
I think he's saying there's footprints with no tracks, and there's the tyre, things like that. Yeah, there's a lot of anomalies associated with the lunar roving vehicle.
None whatsoever.
Yes, there are.
What the tracks look like, which are 1, 2, 4, 2, 4, 7, and then 6 photographs later we have the tracks. Or did they change the tyre, make it a different track?
Yes, you have the chevron-shaped tracks on some. You can see the chevron-shaped treads on some of them, and not on others.
Okay, so what he's saying here is that the imprint left by the wheel is different. Okay. I doubt they're rubber tyres. They're probably sort of wire mesh tyres.
That's right, they are. They're wire mesh tyres. There's no pneumatic element. You can't use pneumatic inner tubes in space because the pressure differential will be too great. They just burst.
And I suspect they would be variable geometry, you know, so as they move around, the actual mesh structure of the wheels would flex and produce different patterns.
No, I don't see how. I mean, looking at this picture here on Wikipedia, you can see there's the wire mesh coating of the wheel, the chevron-shaped treads. This doesn't seem to be flexible anyway. There's the mud guard above it. There's no mud dust guards. I don't see any reason why there should be different patterns as a result of different pressures and things like that.
We'll check that. But I suspect that's going to be the case.
No, I don't think so.
Either that or they're a slightly different pattern front to back. And what we saw was the front, maybe.
No, you wouldn't. No, you can't do that. It's dangerous. It's you can. Do you remember those TV adverts? You know, don't make sure use the same tyres on all 4 wheels, or you might not live to regret it. And a big car crash. Now you have to have the same pattern treads on all 4 wheels, otherwise your car is dangerous. It actually is unstable on the road. And this would count just as much on the moon.
Yeah, could even be. The track's been run over a couple of times. Yeah, who knows? I'd put a line through that.
No, there's just a single track there. Just so you can see it.
I don't think
it's a single track running through the sand or the grit or the dust.
That's evidence of a fake vehicle. Faking the vehicle running around on the moon surface at all. I think that's just it's more.
Honestly, watch that make-believe documentary and watch the enhanced version with the captions, so you can understand what's being said, and you can see they talk an awful lot about this lunar rover, the way it moves, and the patterns and the patterns of the displaced dust as you can see it driving along.
Catching at straws.
Herringbone pattern as opposed to square pattern. Again, anomaly, different. When Apollo 17 or any of them took off, they took off This was filmed from the camera mounted on the Lunar.
Now we're talking about the takeoff after the mission, where the ascent stage blasts off into space, where the astronauts go back on board the craft and they take off their spacesuits, they repressurize the cabin, and they launch the craft back up into space. I just want to pause here for a moment, because Curious Droid on YouTube, who I follow, because he's very interesting actually, chap. He's an interesting chap, although he completely and utterly believes the official story of Apollo, and is totally against people like me and Marcus who disbelieve it. He uncovered, he used the Freedom of Information Act request to get hold of some NASA documents from the time of Apollo, which tell an absolutely horrifying story. And as I said before, the Apollo missions were the most successful space project in history, with 6 successful missions out of 7. Only one major malfunction, which didn't result in any fatalities. The astronauts came home safely. That's the only major error, the only major thing that went wrong throughout this mission, which is in terms of failure to success ratio, makes it an absolute anomaly, an extraordinary prodigy, an anomaly within the history of space exploration. But you see, NASA had several plans. They knew. People said, well, nothing went wrong. It's nothing. There was no. It's all right. Everything went fine, didn't it? Look, they all came back safely. Nothing to worry about. Well, it's easy to say that afterwards. But what about beforehand? Because you see, the lunar module engine had never been tested before, and it had been tested on the Earth. There had been some mock-ups and even some manned simulators, but it had never been tested on the Moon. There was no probe that had landed using this particular method before. So they didn't know for certain they would work. Now, if the ascent stage failed, supposing they got down on the Moon, they danced around, they drove their little rover around the place, this 77-pound piece of thing they could just carry around. All right, suppose they did all that. They got back into the ascent stage, repressurized the cabin. Right, press the button that starts the rocket motor, nothing happens. Nothing happens. Doesn't work. Well, what do? Well, they can try and fix it if they can, but their ability to fix that engine is very limited. And well, what would they? The thing about it is, if they couldn't get that rocket to work and they couldn't fix it, there's no hope of rescue. They're 250,000 miles away from the Earth. There's no other rocket waiting to go and pick them up, which means they would literally have no way of ever getting off the Moon and getting back to Earth. They would be alone and isolated as no humans have ever been before, and they only have a limited oxygen supply, which would only last a few more hours, which meant they'd be finished. What's more, they would know it, and the mission control, they'd have to discuss this. They'd have to say, sorry guys, you can't come home, which would mean basically they'd be dead within hours. Now, in what Curious Droid discovered with this FOIA request was the policy then would be for mission control would immediately cut all communications with the astronauts up on the Moon. So they just shut off the radio completely. There'd be nothing to discuss because there's nothing they can do. What you can do is sit there and talk to them while they suffocate. Bring their families in to talk to them on the phone. The last conversation they'll ever have. Now, what they actually found out was that they took with them, these astronauts, they took with them cyanide capsules, which they would be given the option of using, possibly, if they wanted to. They wouldn't be obliged to, but they'd say, look, if you need to, you can take these. It's quick, it's painless, it'll all be over in a minute. And then, of course, what would happen, NASA would then have to announce this to the nation. And the president would have to do a speech, and the country would be devastated, and the world would be devastated. These astronauts would be there, possibly they'd be stuck on the Moon, their bodies would dry up, they'd mummify in that environment, and they'd be left on the Moon, possibly forever, in a silent, airless tomb. What a nightmare, what an utter, indescribable nightmare, which was a distinct possibility. And people say they wouldn't be tempted just to fake it if they could. Of course they would be tempted to fake it. I mean, who wouldn't be? Anyway, that's just an aside. I'll just carry on now.
Controlled from Earth by Ed Fendel, who was operating the camera.
He's talking about how the camera was on the rover, which was controlled from Earth by a chap who with a control panel, with a control paddle. Yeah.
And a 2.5 second time delay.
Despite the fact there was a 2.5 second delay with the transmissions and receiving, the guy at mission control was very, very accurate when at actually getting the camera to move at just the right spot to capture the ascent of the ascent stage as it went up like that. Amazing, isn't it? Did he just time it right? I'll just start it. When they say 0, I'll have to already start the camera moving first.
And they got it to launch by pressing button A after launch, presumably, because suddenly it leaps up off here.
Describing the launch of the ascent module.
Which is the same as used on the space shuttle, which does...
We're talking about the engine is hypergolic fuel. You get these two chemicals, you mix them together. There's no spark plug. You just mix these chemicals together and they ignite spontaneously. And that's the actual way this rocket engine works.
It's visible in space.
Yeah, it's an important point. That I said this earlier, that the plume from hypergolic fuels like this is visible in space. The space shuttle uses them, and there's actually photographs of the visible exhaust plume coming out of the nozzle. And also, I also describe the vibration, the actual noise it makes, because it creates a lot of vibration, which can be heard all over the space shuttle, which is a much larger craft than the LEM, with a much smaller engine. So why is it there's no vibration and no noise at all on board the LEM as it descends to the moon?
It's non-visible here. And if you look at the launch pad, this is the lower section of it.
Not quite sure what that means. The fuel is visible in space, but it's not visible here. What does that mean? Are you expecting to see the fuel outside of the fuel tanks?
No, we're talking about the exhaust plume, Steve. Now, if the exhaust plume from a hypergolic engine is visible on board the space shuttle in low Earth orbit, why is it when you see the ascent stage taking off from the moon, it's captured on camera, it looks like a champagne cork coming out the bottle? There's nothing. You see like bits flying off. Seems there's some kind of pressure wave, but then you just see the thing going up into the sky like that. There's no visible flame or exhaust plume at all.
I don't understand that, do you? I think
very
that's
simple.
gibberish. I think this is just more twaddle he's just thrown in for the sake of the presentation.
The Apollo 17 or the Apollo landers. Where did the exhaust go? That's not a hole. It's a flat surface. If you fire a 4,500 pound rocket...
Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, well it's not. Look, if you actually look at the design of the lunar module, and I might leave a link to that below.
She doesn't.
The rocket, the ascent engine doesn't sit flat onto on the top of the descent module. There is a gap there, and
the point he's making here, I should explain, is that when you actually ignite the ascent stage, which is sitting on top of the descent stage of the lunar module, the actual rocket to blast would not necessarily. It might cause some anomalous reactions. For example, it might seeing as the rocket is actually blasting straight down onto the surface of the descent stage, it might make the crafts just go into a spin. Or it might, if you actually ignite it in space before the landing, which was a possibility that you might have to do, it would set the descent stage spinning round and possibly crashing into the ascent stage and things like that. So Steve's going to explain how they got around that.
Find that it's the diagram that he showed. It showed the top of the descent module being flat. It's actually scalloped. It's sort of scalloped out in 4 directions to allow the thrust to go out in 4 different directions.
Oh, it's this thing. Whenever you launch a rocket, you have to have some way to allow the exhaust material to actually basically channel away into the air. All rocket pads have this, and according to Steve, this is what the lunar module had. It had like scallops, that is, channels, which actually directed the rocket exhaust thrust away to the side. So you wouldn't get this spinning or this rotating or this basically the rocket going out completely out of control as it launches from this flat surface. However, I'll let him carry on. I want to say some more in a minute.
Bottom of the ascent module is similarly scalloped. It sort of allows its channels for the thrust. So this is just another thing that he's either clueless about or he's deliberately ignoring.
Really, I've got a photograph here of the ascent stage of the lunar module. There's several of them. You can see them in several different places. Several different versions. I don't see anything like that on there. Let's have a look at the descent stage. Here we are, lunar module descent stage. Let's have a look at that. Right, I see. There's no Apollo. Here's the design. Here's the design. I don't see any. There appears to be some line. There doesn't seem to appear anything. What I would say scalloping. There are some lines, or basically some corrugated. There's a corrugated effect. This is a model from wildtoys.com. This is just a model thing. Let's have a look at the LEM descent stage. Let's have a look at this in more detail. Apollo lunar module. Here's the big image. Come on. I don't see any. There's no scalloping that I can see here. None at all. And there's several other images here. No, that's the command module. Right. So no, there's a picture of that. No, there's nothing I can say which would be you would call scallop. Here's a LEM descent stage. Quad 1, 2, compartment 1. Mesa palette. No, the kind of scalloping he's talking about, that is directional channels for rocket thrusts. I can't see it anywhere here. Either on this ascent stage or the descent stage. I can't see it anywhere, Steve.
Okay, I'm getting a bit weary of watching this guy, to be perfectly honest.
I'm getting weary of listening to you, Steve. I'm not weary of listening to your information. I'm weary of you keeping on making these personal attacks on Marcus. Marcus is a friend of mine. He doesn't deserve this.
Literally underneath you. With no.
Yeah, he's got no idea what he's talking about. I'll see if there's anything else. Okay, let's have a quick look at this bit.
On the moon, this photograph is the only one I've found for many years. It shows an object moving across the lunar surface taken in 1966, i.e. before any other.
We looked at Google.
Right, this is interesting because Marcus has shown maybe one of the reasons they faked the moon landing is because of what is actually on the moon. He shows what looks like some kind of object that's moving across the lunar surface, leaving a trail behind it. There's a photograph taken in 1966 by the Surveyor probe, which you see this object leaving this trail behind it. And there's 50 years later, in 2016, the Lunar Surveyor captured the same object. So there's two photographs 50 years apart showing the same thing. Steve is going to tell you what he thinks about it now.
Moon, from there to there, would be all downhill. It certainly looks that way, doesn't it? If you actually look at that picture, that looks like that's broken off there, and it's rolled down there, and it's stopped. Now, he's got another picture of this, and if it's 50 years later, and it's got the same amount of loops in it, I'd say that's all that is. It's a rock that's broken off and rolled down. So I don't think...
So Steve is saying this is nothing anomalous. It's just simply a rock that happens to have rolled downhill. It's maybe got disturbed by a moonquake or something. It's just rolled down the hill.
I don't think there's anything there. It doesn't look like a machine to me. Oops, where are we going with that? Yeah, that doesn't.
I've seen things like these on Mars as well.
Look like a machine to me. Okay.
There are two objects here. One here, small one here, big one.
It's come to rest there. And again, I suspected we had a little Google Moon, had a look at this on Google Moon. This would be much higher here than that is there. And
he's saying it's a downhill slope. It's gone on a downhill slope, which is why it is a rock that's just rolled downhill. To be honest, that is a possibility, and there may not be anything particularly interesting about this particular image. However, there are many, many other anomalous images of the lunar surface which show structures which really shouldn't be there. This is a big subject, and I don't have time to go into it now. I have covered it on other videos, my history of exopolitics video, for example. But there are signs that there are structures on the surface of the moon that look as if they've been artificially constructed. I don't know who by or what by, maybe by an extraterrestrial civilization, possibly by a antediluvian ancient human civilization that reached the moon in the distant past. Possibly this is related to the stuff that's on Mars, because you see exactly the same thing on Mars. You see these strange, very, very odd, artificial structures, clearly artificial structures. So maybe Marcus has got it wrong about this particular example, but the point he's making is very valid. And the point that this could be one of the reasons why our government on Earth don't want anybody really exploring the moon, and they'd rather just fake missions.
It's simple as that. It's just rolled down, and because of the shape of the boulder, it's made the pattern in the dust as it's rolled. I don't think there's anything more to that than that. Okay.
I don't know what they are.
Right, here we go.
Why not? I wonder if they did a Q&A afterwards.
Yes, we did. We did do a Q&A with all the speakers, and you can see it, Steve, on my channel. Okay, now I'm just going to move on to the last part here, which is Steve's 3 favourite clips that prove Marcus is lying. Here we go. 122. There we go. Nearly at the end now, thank goodness.
Knows full well this far through the video. As always, congratulations. I'm going to leave you with my...
Oops, we've got a bit of buffering now. Come on. Don't know what's happening here.
If there's 2 of them, then it's 2 rocks. I don't think there's anything more to it than that. It's very close to the end. Video, as always, congratulations. I'm going to leave you with my 3 favourite clips from Mr. Allen that prove beyond any doubt that Marcus Allen knows full well that the Americans went to the moon.
That is a very, very serious allegation you're making, Steve. You say this proves beyond any doubt that Marcus actually knows the Americans are going to the moon and is pretending they're not, so he can go to conferences like mine. I hope you've got some evidence for this.
Okay. Regardless of what he says in his presentation, he believes they went to the moon.
What's this? Regardless of what he says in his presentation, he believes they went to the moon. Well, how do you know? Are you a mind reader, Steve? Can you see inside his head and capture his thoughts? How dare you? You really are behaving badly in this particular video.
Otherwise you wouldn't hear comments like these.
Oh,
now,
right.
This is from the source video. So look at the
All right, here's the comments. Okay, so this is how we know.
timestamp 51:55. Okay, let's see what he's got to say.
It's a very weird situation. Anyway, here are the heroes.
He's talking about the photographs of Aldrin and Armstrong, allegedly in Lem.
And I put it in that format because this was taken from a book brought at the Kennedy Space Center with a NASA publication.
Okay, you're just repeating a point you've made before, Steve. This is where Marcus questions whether the photographs of Aldrin and Armstrong in the LEM after they'd been on the moon were really taken on the moon. So you're just repeating a point you've made before. So what's your next clip then, eh?
Okay, let's have the next one. Here's the next one.
Same clip, same thing.
With highlight of light. This was indicative of a flashlight being used.
You're talking about possibly a flashbulb being used. You've covered this.
The highlight of light in the eye, if you look at any paparazzi photograph of any celebrity, you'll see a highlight of light in the eye. Because it indicates a flashlight is used.
Yeah.
Oh, hang on, I forgot to show you the timestamp on the source video. There we are, it's 53:20.
To illuminate it. His teeth are also have a highlight there, which is the same thing. So this was taken under control conditions.
This is just repeating what he's done before. He's talking about Marcus talks about these photographs of Aldrin and Armstrong. You see the lighting effects on their
It was
face.
taken under controlled conditions in the simulation rig before they even went to the moon. Okay, the next one.
Why is that proof?
And again, all these Freudian slips, Mr. Allen.
It's not before they even went to the moon. I mean, that's not a Freudian slip. He's done the same thing as I do, is talking about the, you know, allegedly. I think Marcus just forgot to insert the word allegedly there. This is not proof, Steve. This is not evidence that Marcus is lying.
Yes,
He's talking about the Germans.
I've done this. I have sometimes said before they went, you know, going to the moon, I've talked about it as if it were real, as just simply as to make the point. This is all Marcus is doing. It's not a Freudian slip. He's not saying all this before they went to the moon, because is he supposed to, in every single time he mentions this possibility, to say allegedly, insert the word allegedly, or to say if they had gone to the moon, this would what would have happened? Because that's just a mouthful. This is not evidence, Steve. This is not evidence that Marcus is lying. Nearly at the end.
Scientists that the Americans got working on the Apollo program, you know, von Braun and co,
Yeah.
or the German rocket scientists.
We've already covered that.
Note, not special effects experts, the German rocket scientists.
Yeah.
Now just listen to what he says about the German rocket scientists.
English scientists. They were all Germans who got America to the moon. They were all not.
He said get America to... Yeah, look, I understand what the point you're making now, Steve. All right, you're saying because he says these things, well, I see German scientists got America to the moon. He's being ironic. It's kind of sarcasm. It's a kind of parody. He's simply saying, oh yeah, if he's not going to say, well, he's not going to have. Does he have to say at the end of this, would have got America to the moon if they had been to the moon? Because that's just a mouthful. That's just a word salad. It's just, you know, Marcus can't be expected to do this. Surely you're an Australian. You understand sardonic statements, don't you? Oh, we're nearly at the end now. Thank goodness.
They were all Germans that got America to the moon. He's really not doing very well, is Mr. Allen, is he?
He does
with
excellently.
his presentation. What more can I say?
Nothing, Robert. I'm glad you find it amusing. That's the end. So what we have here is Steve Mumbling has decided to throw down the gauntlet. He's decided to try and disprove the hypothesis that the moon landings were faked, and he's presented a case for that, which I've replied to, and I think he is wrong. I think he made a mistake here. I think Marcus presents some valid evidence which deserves to be taken seriously. So I think, Steve, you have failed to disprove Marcus Allen. You failed to prove that the moon landings, the official story of the moon landings, is correct, and in doing so you've behaved badly. You've made a lot of personal comments about Steve, about Marcus, saying that things such as he knows the moon landings were real. Really, he's just pretending they're not. You said that, which I think is unfair and wrong, and it's disreputable of you. You've said, oh, he's just trying to peddle his magazine of codswallop and twaddle and these various other things. Again, that I think is it's an assertion you make about somebody's character for which you've got no evidence. You've got no reason to denounce them in this way. You just thought you'd say it, and you think it's okay to say it without any evidence, without any reason for saying that, just because you disagree with them. And that is an intellectually dishonest and unprofessional way of conducting yourself. You've produced an awful lot of material here. I've tried to. I do like replying to your videos. Normally, you know, I quite like you as a person. You're normally a lot nicer than this, and I'll happy to counter what you say. Yeah, but in this case, I think you have failed to prove your hypothesis. I think your conclusion is wrong. We should be questioning the moon landings, the official story of the moon landings. I'm not suggesting no one has been to the moon. When you take into account the secret space program, I think it's very unlikely that nobody has ever thought about jetting up in one of those anti-gravity craft and landing on our nearest neighbour. What I suggest is that, as Marcus suggests, that the official story of man's first expedition to the moon is incorrect. That it was done at the time using the methods and personnel that history tells us it was done by. You claim that you can prove that this is not the case. You can claim that you can prove that the official history of the Apollo missions is true by discrediting the evidence that me and Marcus put across. I think you failed to do that. You may have detected a couple of errors that we have made, minor errors, almost subsidiary errors, really, that really do not affect the main thrust of our argument. But you have utterly failed to undermine our central argument, I would say. As always, I leave listeners, or reviewers rather, to make up their own minds. Listeners, if you ever catch Hapanmo Radio every Thursday evening. But I encourage Hapanmo TV viewers to make your own minds up on this. Check the evidence. Check what Steve has said about this, by all means. Look at his other videos. But also look at allist.com. Look at what David Percy, Mary Bennett, Andrew Johnson, Richard E. Hall, myself, and others have actually written about this. There's Bill Casing, Rennie Renee, Jim Collier. There's a lot of people who have looked into this. Make sure you have all the information before generating a conclusion. And when you generate a conclusion, make it scientific, make it rational. Don't just say, well, I'm right because the person who disagrees with me is a hashtag bad person. Alright? Because that's what Steve's done in this video, and I think it's wrong. But I hope you enjoyed this, all of you. Thanks again to Steve Mumbling for giving me grist from my mill to encourage me to put photons to celluloid, and I shall see you on the next Hapanmo TV video, which will not be long, I hope. Hospital porters, pride and dignity. Stop the New World Order.